Andrews still hadn't phoned. By noon, Dunworthy sent Colin over to infirmary to be inoculated. He came back looking pained. "It's bad at all?" that Dunworthy asked. "Worse," Carlin said, flinging himself down on the window seat. "Mrs. Gadsden caught me coming in. I was rubbing my arm, and she demanded to know where I'd been and why I was getting inoculated instead of William." He looked reproachfully at Dunworthy. "Well, it hurts," she said. "If anyone was high risk, it was poor Willie, and it was absolute necrophilia for me to be jabbed instead of him. Nepotism, nepotism. I hope the priest finds her. An absolutely cadaverous job. How was your great-aunt Mary? I didn't see her. They were awfully busy. Beds in the corridor and everything." Colin and Dunworthy took turns going over to Hall for Christmas dinner. Colin was back in something less than 15 minutes. The bell ringers started to play. He said, "Mr. Finch said to tell you, we're out of sugar and butter and nearly out of cream." He pulled a jelly tart out of his jacket pocket. "Why is it they never run out of Brussels sprouts?" Dunworthy gave him orders to come, tell him at once if Andrews phoned, and to take down any other messages, and went over. The bell ringers were in full cry. Jangling away at a Mozart canon, Finch handed Dunworthy a plate that seemed to be mostly Brussels sprouts. "We're nearly out of turkey, I'm afraid, sir," he said. "I'm glad you've come. It's almost time for the Queen's Christmas message." The bell ringers finished the Mozart to enthusiastic applause, and Miss Taylor came over, still wearing her white gloves. "There you are, Mr. Dunworthy," she said. "I missed you at breakfast, and Mr. Finch said you were the one to talk to. We need a practice room." He was tempted to say, "I'd no idea you practiced." He ate a Brussels sprout. "A practice room? Yes, so we can practice our Chicago surprise mina. I've arranged with the Dean of Christ Church to ring our peal here on New Year's Day, but we have to have somewhere to practice. I told Mr. Finch the big room in Beard would be perfect, the senior common room, but Mr. Finch said it was being used as a storeroom for supplies." "What supplies?" He thought according to Finch, they were either out or nearly out of everything, save Brussels sprouts, and he said the lecture rooms were being kept to use as an infirmary. "We have to have a quiet place where we can focus. The Chicago surprise minor is very complicated. The in and out of course changes and the lead and alterations require complete concentration. And of course there's the extra dodging, of course." Dunworthy said, "The room doesn't have to be large, but it does need to be secluded. We've been practicing here in the dining room, but there are people in and out all the time, and the tenor keeps losing her place. I'm sure we can find something. Of course with 7 bells we should be doing triples, but the North American Council rang Philadelphia triples here last year and did a very sloppy job of it too. As I understand, the tenor, a full count behind an absolutely terrible stroking, which is another reason we've got to have a good practice room. Stroking is so important, of course," Dunworthy said. Mrs. Gadsden appeared in the far doorway, looking fierce and maternal. "I'm afraid I have an important trunk call coming in," he said, standing up, so that Miss Taylor was between him and Mrs. Gadsden. "Trunk call," Miss Taylor said, shaking her head. "You English, I don't understand what you're saying half the time." Dunworthy escaped out the buttery door, promising to find a practice room so that they could perfect their snapping leads, and went back up to his rooms. Andrews hadn't phoned. There was one message from Montoya. "She said to tell you never mind," Colin said. "That's all. She didn't say anything else." "No," she said. "Tell Mr. Dunworthy never mind." He wondered if she had by some miracle located Basingham and obtained his signature, or if she had merely found out whether he was salmon or trout. He debated ringing her back, but he was afraid the lines would choose that moment to unjam, and Andrews would phone. He didn't, or they didn't, until nearly 4. "I'm terribly sorry I didn't ring you sooner." Andrews said there was still no picture, but down below. They could hear music and talk in the background. I was away till last night, and I've had a good deal of trouble getting through to you. Andrews said the lines have been engaged. Holiday crush, you know. I've been trying every I need you to come up to Oxford. Dunworthy cut in, I need you to read a fix. Of course, sir, Andrew said promptly. When? Soon as possible this evening. Oh, he said less promptly. Would tomorrow do? My living won't get until late tonight. So we'd planned on having our Christmas tomorrow. But I could get a train up in the afternoon or evening. Will that do, or is there a limit on taking the fix? The fix is already taken, but the text come down with a virus. And I need someone to read it, Dunworthy said. There was a sudden burst of laughter from Andrew's end. Dunworthy raised his voice. What time do you think you can be here? I'm not certain. Can I ring you back tomorrow and tell you when I'll be coming in? On the tube? Yes, but you can only take the tube as far as Barton. You'll need to take a taxi from there to the perimeter. I'll arrange for you to be let through. All right, Andrews. He didn't answer. Though down below they could still hear the music. Andrews. Dunworthy said, are you still there? It was maddening not to be able to see. Yes, sir, Andrews said, but wearily. What was it you said you wanted me to do? Read a fix. It's already been taken, but the tech. Know the other bit about taking the train to Barton. Take the train to Barton, Dunworthy said loudly and carefully. That's as far as it goes from there. You'll have to get a taxi to the quarantine perimeter. Quarantine? Yes, Dunworthy said, irritated. I'll arrange for you to be allowed into the quarantine area. What sort of quarantine? A virus. He said you haven't heard about it. No, sir. I was running and on site in Florence. I only arrived back this afternoon. Is it serious? He did not sound frightened, only interested. 81 cases so far, Dunworthy said. 80 to Collins said from the window seat. But they've identified it, and the vaccine's on the way. There haven't been any fatalities, but a lot of unhappy people who wanted to be home for Christmas. I'll wager he said, I'll call you in the morning. Then as soon as I know what time I'll arrive. Yes, Dunworthy shouted, to make sure. Andrews could hear over the background noise. I'll be here, right, Andrews said. There was another burst of laughter, and then silence as he rang off. Is he coming? Colin asked. Yes, tomorrow. He punched in Gilchrist's number. Gilchrist appeared, sitting at his desk and looking belligerent. Mr. Dunworthy, if this is about pulling Miss Engel out, I would if I could, Dunworthy thought, and wondered if Gilchrist truly didn't realize Kevin had already left the drop site and wouldn't be there if they did open the net. No, he said. I've located a tech who can come read the fix. Mr. Dunworthy, may I remind you, I am fully aware that you are in charge of this drop. Dunworthy said, trying to keep his temper. I was merely trying to help. Knowing the difficulty of finding techs over VAC, I telephoned one and reading. He can be here tomorrow. Gilchrist pursed his lips disapprovingly. None of this would be necessary if your tech hadn't fallen ill. But as he has, I suppose this will have to do. Have him report to me as soon as he arrives. Dunworthy managed to say goodbye civilly, but as soon as the screen went blank, he slammed the receiver down, yanked it up again, and began stabbing numbers. He would find buzzing gum if it took all afternoon, but the computer came on and informed him. All lines were engaged again. He laid the receiver down and stared at the blank screen. Are you waiting for another call? Colin asked. No. Then can we walk over to infirmary? I have a present for Great Aunt Mary, and I can see about getting Andrews into the quarantine area. He thought, excellent idea, you can wear your new muffler. Colin stuffed it into his jacket pocket. I'll put it on when we get there, he said, grinning. I don't want anyone to see me on the way. There was no one to see them. The streets were completely deserted. Not even any bicycles or taxis. Dunworthy thought of the vicar's remark that when the epidemic took hold, people would hole up in their houses. Either that or They had been driven inside by the sound of the Carfax Carillon, which was not only still banging away at the carol of the bells, but seemed louder echoing through the empty streets. Or they were napping after too much Christmas dinner, or they knew enough to keep out of the rain. They saw no one at all until they got to infirmary. A woman in a Burberry stood in front of the casualties ward, holding a picket sign that said, "Ban foreign diseases." A man wearing a regulation face mask opened the door for them and handed Dunworthy a very damp flyer. Dunworthy asked at the admissions desk for Mary, and then read the flyer. In bold face type it said, "Fight influenza, vote to succeed." From the EC underneath was a paragraph. Why will you be separated from your loved ones? This Christmas, why are you forced to stay in Oxford? Why are you in danger of getting ill and dying? Because the EC allows infected foreigners to enter England, and England doesn't have a thing to say about it. An Indian immigrant carrying a deadly virus. Dunworthy didn't read the rest. He turned it over. It read, "A vote for secession is a vote for Health Committee. For an independent Great Britain." Mary came in, and Colin grabbed his muffler out of his pocket and wrapped it hastily around his neck. "Happy Christmas," he said. "Thank you for the muffler. Shall I open your cracker for you?" "Yes, please." Mary said she looked tired. She was wearing the same lab coat she had on 2 days ago. Someone had pinned a cluster of holly to the lapel. Colin snapped the cracker. "Put your hat on," he said, unfolding a blue paper crown. "Have you managed to get any rest at all?" Dunworthy asked. "A bit," she said, putting the crown on over her untidy gray hair. "We've had 30 new cases since noon, and I've spent most of the day trying to get the sequencing from the WIC, but the lines are jammed." "I know," Dunworthy said. "Can I see Boudry? Only for a minute or two," she frowned. "He's not responding at all to the synthemycin, and neither are the 2 students from the dance. In Headington, Beverly Breen is a bit improved." She frowned. "It worries me." "Have you had your enhancement?" "Not yet." Collins had his, and it hurt like blood, Collins said, unfolding the slip of paper inside the cracker. "Shall I read your motto for you?" She nodded. "I need to bring a tech into the quarantine area tomorrow to read Kevin's fix." Dunworthy said, "What must I do to arrange it?" "Nothing so far as I know. They're trying to keep people in, not out." The registrar took Mary aside and spoke softly and urgently to her. "I must go," she said. "I don't want you to leave till you've had your enhancement. Come back down here when you've seen Boudry. Colin, you wait here for Mr. Dunworthy." Dunworthy went up to isolation. There was no one at the desk, so he wrestled his way into a set of SPGs, remembering to put the gloves on last, and went inside. The pretty nurse who had been so interested in William was taking Boudry's pulse, her eyes on the screens. Dunworthy stopped at the foot of the bed. Mary had said Boudry wasn't responding, but Dunworthy was still shocked by the sight of him. His face was dark with fever again, and his eyes looked bruised as if someone had hit him. His right arm was hooked to an elaborate shunt. It was bruised a purple-blue on the inside of the elbow. The other arm was worse, black all along the forearm. "Bordier," he said, and the nurse shook her head. "You can only stay a moment," she said. Dunworthy nodded. She laid Brodier's unresisting hand down at his side, typed something on the console, and went out. Dunworthy sat down beside the bed and looked up at the screens. They looked the same, still indecipherable. The graphs and jags and generating numbers, telling him nothing. He looked at Boudry, who lay there looking battered, beaten. He patted his hand gently and stood up to go. "It was the rats," Boudry murmured. "Boudry," Dunworthy said gently. "It's Mr. Dunworthy, Mr. Dunworthy," Padres said, but he didn't open his eyes. "I'm dying, aren't I?" He felt a twinge of fear. "No, of course not," he said heartily. "Where'd you get that idea?" "It's always fatal," Padre said. "What is?" But Renee didn't answer. Dunworthy sat with him until the nurse came in, but he didn't say anything else. "Mr. Dunworthy," she said, He needs to rest, I know. He walked to the door and then looked back at Bettery. Lying in the bed, he opened the door. It killed them all, Bettery said. Half of Europe. Colin was standing at the registrar's desk when he came back down, telling her about his Christmas gifts. My mother's gifts didn't arrive because of the quarantine. The postman wouldn't let them through. Dunworthy told the registrar about the tea. Cell enhancement, and she nodded and said, "It will just be a moment." They sat down to wait. It killed them all. Dunworthy thought, half of Europe. I didn't get to read her motto. Colin said, "Would you like to hear it?" He didn't wait for an answer. Where was Father Christmas when the lights went out? He waited expectantly. Dunworthy shook his head in the dark. He took his gobstopper out of his pocket, unwrapped it, and stuck it in his mouth. "You're worried about your girl, aren't you?" "Yes." He folded up the gobstopper wrapper into a tiny packet. "What I don't understand is why can't you go get her? She isn't there. We must wait for the rendezvous." "No, I mean, why can't you go back to the same time you sent her through and get her while she was still there? Before anything happened. I mean, you can go to any time you want. Can't you know?" he said. "You can send an historian to any time, but once she's there, the net can only operate in real time. Did you study the paradoxes at school?" "Yes," Connor said, but he sounded uncertain. "They're like time travel rules. The space-time continuum doesn't allow paradoxes." Dunworthy said, "It would be a paradox if Kevin made something happen that hadn't happened, or if she caused an anachronism." Colin was still looking uncertain. "One of the paradoxes is that no one can be in two places at the same time. She's already been in the past for days. There's nothing we can do to change that. It's already happened. Then how did she get back? When she went through, the tech took what's called a fix. It tells the tech exactly where she is, and it acts as He groped for an understandable word. "A tether. It ties the two times together, so the net can be reopened at a certain time, and she can be picked up. Like I'll meet you at the church at 6:30 exactly. It's called a rendezvous. Kevin's is in 2 weeks, December 28th. On that day, the tech will open the net, and Kevin will come back through." "I thought you said it was the same time there. How can the 28th be 2 weeks from now?" "They used a different calendar in the Middle Ages. It's December the 17th there. Our rendezvous date is the 6th of January. If she's there, if I can find a tech to open the net." Colin pulled out his gobstoppers and looked at it thoughtfully. It was a mottled, bluish white, and looked rather like a map of the moon. He stuck it back in his mouth. "So if I went to 1320 on December 26th, I could have Christmas twice." "Yes, I suppose so. A pocket tick," he said. He unfolded the gobstopper wrapper and folded it into an even tinier packet. "I think they've forgotten about you. Don't you? It's beginning to look that way," Dunworthy said, the next time a house officer came through. Dunworthy stopped him and told him he was waiting for tea. "Cell enhancement. Oh," he said, looking surprised. "I'll try to find out about it." He disappeared into casualties. They waited some more. It was the rats, Bardray had said, and that first night he had asked Dunworthy, "What year is it?" But he had said there was minimal slippage. He had said the apprentice's calculations were correct. Colin took his gobstopper out and examined it several times for changing color. "If something terrible happened, couldn't you break the rules?" he said, squinting at it. "If she got her arm cut off, or she died, or a bomb blew her up or something. They're not rules, Colin. They're scientific laws. We couldn't break them if we tried, if we attempted to reverse events. That had already happened. The net wouldn't open." Colin spits his gobstopper into the wrapper and folds the wrinkled paper carefully around it. "I'm sure your girl's all right," he said. He jammed the wrapped gobstopper in his jacket pocket and pulled out a lumpy parcel. "I forgot to give Great Aunt Mary her Christmas present." He said. He jumped up and started into casualties. before Dunworthy could caution him to wait, got opposite the door and came tearing back blood. "The gallstone's here," he said. "She's coming this way." Dunworthy stood up. "That's all that's needed this way." Colin said, "I came in the back door the night I got here." He sprinted off in the other direction. "Come on." Dunworthy couldn't manage a sprint, but he walked quickly down the labyrinth of corridors. Colin indicated an out-of-service entrance into a side street. A man in a sandwich board was standing outside the door. In the rain, the sandwich board said, "The doom we feared is upon us," which seemed oddly fitting. "I'll make certain she didn't see us," Colin said and dashed around to the front. The man handed Dunworthy a flyer. "The end of time is near." It said in fiery capital letters, "Fear God. For the hour of his judgment is come." Revelations, chapter 14, verse 7. Colin waved to Dunworthy from the corner. "It's all right," Colin said. Slightly out of breath, "She's inside," shouting at the registrar. Dunworthy handed the flyer back to the man and followed Colin. He led the way along the side street to Woodstock Road. Dunworthy looked anxiously toward the door of casualties, but he couldn't see anyone, not even the anti-EC picketers. Colin sprinted another block and then slowed to a walk. He pulled the packet of soap tablets out of his pocket and offered Dunworthy one. He declined. Colin popped a pink one in his mouth and said, "None too clearly. This is the best Christmas I've ever had." Dunworthy pondered that sentiment for several blocks. The Carillon was massacring in the bleak midwinter, which also seemed fitting. And the streets were still deserted, but as they turned down the Broad, a familiar figure hurried toward them, hunched against the rain. "It's Mr. Finch," Colin said. "Good Lord," Dunworthy said. "What do you suppose we've run out of now? I hope it's Brussels sprouts." Finch had looked up at the sound of their voices. "There you are, Mr. Dunworthy. Thank goodness, I've been looking for you everywhere." "What is it?" Dunworthy said. "I told Miss Taylor I'd see about a practice room." "It isn't that, sir. It's the detainees. 2 of them are down with the virus." Transcript from the Doomsday Book, 21st of December 1320, Old Style. "Bartholomeus doesn't know where the drop is. I made him take me to the place where Garwin met him. But even standing in the clearing didn't jog my memory. It's obvious Garwin didn't happen upon him until he was a long way from the drop. And by that time I was completely delirious, and I realized today I'll never be able to find the drop on my own. The woods are too big and they're full of clearings, and oak trees and willow thickets that all look alike. Now that it's snowed, I should have marked the drop with something. Besides the casket, Garwin will have to show me where the drop is. And he's not back yet. Rosamond told me it's only a half-day's ride to Corsi, but that he will probably spend the night there because of the rain. It's been raining hard since we got back, and I suppose I should be happy, since it may melt the snow, but it makes it impossible for me to go out and look for the drop. And it's freezing in the manor house. Everyone's wearing their cloaks and huddling next to the fire. What do the villagers do? Their huts can't even keep the wind out, and the one I was in had no sign of a blanket. They must be literally freezing, and Rosamond said the steward said it was going to rain till Christmas Eve. Rosamond apologized for her ill-tempered behavior in the woods and told me I was wroth with my sister. Agnes had nothing to do with it. What upset her was obviously the news that her fiancé had been invited for Christmas, and when I had a chance with Rosamond alone, I asked her if she was worried over her marriage. "My father has arranged it," she said, threading her needle. "We were betrothed at Martinmas. We are to be wed at Easter, and it is with your consent." I asked. "It is a good match," she said. "Sir Bloet is highly placed, and he has holdings that adjoin my father's. Do you like him?" She stabbed the needle into the linen. "In the wooden frame, my father would never let me come to harm," she said, and pulled a long thread through. She didn't volunteer anything else. and all I could get out of Agnes was that Sir Bloa was nice and had brought her a silver penny. No doubt as part of the betrothal gifts, Agnes was too concerned about her knee to tell me anything else. She stopped complaining about it halfway home and then limped, exaggeratedly, when she got down off the sorrel. I thought she was just trying to get attention, but when I looked at it, the scab had come off completely. The area around it is red and swollen. I washed it off, wrapped it in as clean a cloth as I could find. I'm afraid it may have been one of Hermione's quilts. I found it in the chest at the foot of the bed and made her sit quietly by the fire and play with her knight. But I'm worried if it gets infected, it could be serious. There weren't any antimicrobials in the 1300s. Eloise is worried too. She clearly expected Garwin back tonight and has been going to stand by the screens all day, looking out the door. I have not been able to figure out how she feels about Garwin. Sometimes, like today, I think she loves him and is afraid of what that means for both of them. Adultery was a mortal sin in the eyes of the church, and often a dangerous one, but most of the time. I am convinced that his amour is completely unrequited, that she is so worried about her husband that she doesn't know he exists. The pure, unattainable lady was the ideal of courtly romances, but it's clear he doesn't know whether or not she loves him either. His rescuing me in the wood and his story of the renegades was only an attempt to impress her, which would have been much more impressive if there had been 20 renegades, all armed with swords and maces and battle axes. He would obviously do anything to win her, and Lady Imani knows it, which is why I think he's been sent off to Corsi. Chapter 18. By the time they got back to Belil, 2 more of the detainees were down with the virus. Dunworthy sent Colin to bed and helped Finch get the detainees to bed and phone the infirmary. All our ambulances are out, the registrar told him. We'll send one as soon as possible. As soon as possible was midnight. He didn't get back into bed till past 1. Colin was asleep on the cot Finch had set up for him, the Age of Chivalry next to his head. Dunworthy debated pulling the book away, but he didn't want to risk waking him. He went into bed. Kevin could not be in the plague, but we had said there were 4 hours slippage, and the plague had not hit England until 1348. Kevin had been sent to 1320. He turned over and closed his eyes determinedly. She could not be in the plague. Badri was delirious. He had said all sorts of things, talked about lids and breaking china as well as rats. None of it made any sense. It was the fever speaking. He had told Unworthy to back up. He had given him imaginary notes. None of it meant anything. It was the rats, Bartery had said. The contempts hadn't known. It was spread by fleas on the rats. They had had no idea what caused it. They had accused everyone. Jews and witches and the insane. They had murdered half-wits and hanged old women. They had burned strangers at the stake. He got out of bed and padded into the sitting room. He tiptoed around Colin's cot and slid the Age of Chivalry out from under Colin's head. Colin stirred but didn't wake. Dunworthy sat on the window seat and looked up. The Black Death, it had started in China in 1333 and moved west on trading ships to Messina. In Sicily and from there to Pisa, it had spread through Italy and France. 80,000 died in Siena, 100,000 in Florence, 300,000 in Rome, before it crossed the Channel. It had reached England in 1348, a little before the feast of St. John the Baptist. June 24th, that meant a slippage of 28 years. Padre had been worried about too much slippage, but he had been talking of weeks, not years. He reached over the cot to the bookcase and took down Fitzwilliam's Pandemics. "What are you doing?" Colin asked sleepily. "Reading about the Black Death," he whispered. "Go back to sleep." They didn't call it that. Colin mumbled around his gobstopper. He rolled over, wrapping himself in his blankets. They called it the Blue Sickness. Dunworthy took both books back to bed with him. Fitzwilliam gave the date of the plague's arrival in England. As St. Peter's Day, June 29, 1348, it had reached Oxford in December, London in October of 1349, and then moved north and back across the Channel. To the Low Countries and Norway, it had gone everywhere except Bohemia and Poland, which had a quarantine, and oddly parts of Scotland. Where it had gone, it had swept through the countryside, like the angel of death, devastating entire villages, leaving no one alive to administer the last rites or bury the putrefying bodies. In one monastery, all but one of the monks had died. The single survivor, John Klyn, had left a record, and less things which should be remembered, perish with time and vanish from the memory of those who are to come after us, he had written. I, seeing so many evils, and the whole world, as it were, placed within the grasp of the evil one, being myself as if among the dead, I, waiting for death, have put into writing all the things that I have witnessed. He had written it all down, a true historian, and then had apparently died himself. All alone, his writing on the manuscript trailed off, and below it in another hand, someone had written, Here it seems the author died. Someone knocked on the door. It was Finch in his bathrobe, looking bleary-eyed and distraught. Another one of the detainees, sir, he said. Dunworthy put his finger to his lips and stepped outside the door with him. Have you telephoned infirmary? Yes, sir. And they said, it would be several hours before they can dispatch an ambulance, they said, to isolate her and give her Dimantin and orange juice, which I suppose we're nearly out of. Dunworthy said irritably, yes, sir. But that's not the problem, she won't cooperate. Dunworthy made Finch wait outside the door while he dressed and found his face mask, and they went across to Salvin. A huddle of detainees were standing by the door, dressed in an odd assortment of underthings, coats and blankets. Only a few of them were wearing their face masks. By the day after tomorrow, they'll all be down with it, Dunworthy thought. Thank goodness you're here, one of the detainees said fervently. We can't do a thing with her. Finch led him over to the detainee, who was sitting upright in bed. She was an elderly woman with sparse white hair, and she had the same fever-bright eyes, the same frenetic alertness. Berdier had had that first night. Go away, she said, when she saw Finch and made a slapping motion at him. She turned her burning eyes on Dunworthy. Daddy, she cried, and then stuck her lower lip out in a pout. I was very naughty, she said in a childish voice. I ate all the birthday cake, and now I have a stomach ache. Do you see what I mean, sir? Finch put in. Are the Indians coming, Daddy? She asked. I don't like Indians. They have bows and arrows. It took them until morning to get her onto a cot. In one of the lecture rooms, Dunworthy eventually had to resort to saying, Your daddy wants his good girl to lie down now. And just after they had her quieted down, the ambulance came. Daddy, she wailed when they shut the doors, don't leave me here all alone, oh dear. Finch said when the ambulance drove off, it's past breakfast time. I do hope they haven't eaten all the bacon. He went off to ration supplies, and Dunworthy went back to his rooms to wait for Andrew's call. Colin was halfway down the staircase, eating a piece of toast and pulling on his jacket. The vicar wants me to help collect clothes for the detainees, he said, with his mouth full of toast. Great Aunt Mary telephone. You're to ring her back, but not Andrew's, no. Has the visual been restored? Nope. Wear your regulation face mask. Dunworthy called after him, and your muffler. He rang up Mary and waited impatiently for nearly 5 minutes, until she came to the telephone. James, Mary's voice said, it's Padre. He's asking for you. He's better than no. His fever's still very high, and he's become quite agitated. Keeps calling your name. Insists he has something to tell you. He's working himself into a very bad state. If you could come and speak with him, it might calm him down. Has he said anything about the plague? He asked. The plague, she said, looking annoyed. Don't tell me you've been infected by these ridiculous rumors that are flying about, James. That is cholera, that is break-bone fever. That is a recurrence of the pandemic. No, Dunworthy said it's Badri. Last night. He said it killed half of Europe and it was the rats. He's delirious, James. It's the fever, it doesn't mean anything. She's right, he told himself. The detainee ran it on about Indians, with bows and arrows. And he didn't begin looking for Sioux warriors. She had conjured up too much birthday cake as an explanation for her being ill, and Badri had conjured up the plague. Didn't mean anything, nevertheless. He said he would be there immediately, and went to find Finch. Andrews hadn't specified what time he would call, but Dunworthy couldn't risk leaving the phone unattended. He wished he'd made Collins stay while he spoke to Mary. Finch would very likely be in hall, guarding the bacon with his life. He took the receiver off the hook, so the phone would sound engaged, and went across the quad to the hall. Miss Taylor met him at the door. "I was just coming to look for you," she said. "I heard some of the detainees came down with the virus." "Last night?" "Yes," he said, scanning the hall for Finch. "Oh dear. So I suppose we've all been exposed." He couldn't see Finch anywhere. "How long is the incubation period?" Miss Taylor asked. 12 to 48 hours, he said. He craned his neck, trying to see over the heads of the detainees. "That's awful," Miss Taylor said. "What if one of us comes down with it?" "In the middle of the peel. We're traditional, you know. Not council, the rules are very explicit." He wondered why traditional, whatever that might be, had deemed it necessary to have rules concerning change ringers infected with influenza. Rule 3, Miss Taylor said. "Every man must stick to his bell without interruption. It isn't as if we can put somebody else in halfway through if any of us suddenly keels over, and it would ruin the rhythm." He had a sudden image of one of the bell ringers, in her white gloves, collapsing and being kicked out of the way, so as not to disrupt the rhythm. "Aren't there any warning symptoms?" Miss Taylor asked. "No," he said. "That paper the NHS sent around said disorientation, fever and headache, but that isn't any good. The bells always give us headaches." I can imagine, he thought, looking for William Gadsden, or one of the other undergraduates he could get to listen for the phone. If we were council, of course, it wouldn't matter. They let people substitute right and left during a peal of Tidham Bob Maxims at York. They had 19 ringers, 19. I don't see how they can even call it a peal. None of his undergraduates appeared to be in hall. Finch had no doubt barricaded himself in the buttery. And Colin was long gone. "Are you still in need of a practice room?" He asked Miss Taylor. "Yes, unless one of us comes down with this thing. Of course we could do Stedman's, but that would hardly be the same thing." "Would it? I'll let you use my sitting room, if you will answer the telephone and take down any messages for me. I am expecting an important trunk long-distance call, so it's essential that someone be in the room at all times." He led her back to his rooms. "Oh, it's not very big, is it?" she said. "I'm not sure there's room to work on our raising. Can we move the furniture around? You may do anything you like, so long as you answer the telephone and take down any messages. I'm expecting a call from Mr. Andrews. Tell him he doesn't need clearance to enter the quarantine area. Tell him to go straight to Brazen-Nosed, and I'll meet him there." "Well, all right, I guess," she said, as if she were doing him a favor. "At least it's better than that drafty cafeteria." He left her rearranging furniture, not at all convinced that it was a good idea to entrust her with this, and hurried off to see Boudreau. He had something to tell him. It killed them all, half of Europe. The rain has subsided to little more than a fine mist, and the anti-EC picketers were gathered in force in front of the infirmary. They had been joined by a number of boys Colin's age, wearing black face blasters and shouting, "Let my people go." One of them grabbed Dunworthy's arm. "The government's got no right to keep you here. Against your will," he said, thrusting his striped face up to Dunworthy's face mask. "Don't be a fool," Dunworthy said. Do you want to start another pandemic? The boy let go of his arm. Looking confused, and Dunworthy escaped inside. Casualties was full of patients on stretcher trolleys, and there was one standing next to the elevator. An imposing-looking nurse in voluminous SPGs was standing next to it, reading something to the patient from a polythene-wrapped book. "Whoever perished being innocent," she said, and he realized with dismay that it wasn't a nurse. It was Mrs. Gadsden, or "Where were the righteous cut off?" She recited. She stopped and thumbed through the thin pages of the Bible, looking for another cheering passage. And he ducked down the side corridor and into a stairwell, eternally grateful to the NHS for issuing face masks. "The Lord shall smite me with a consumption," she intoned, her voice resounding through the corridor as he fled. "And with a fever and with an inflammation, and he shall smite thee with Mrs. Gadsden," he thought, "and she shall read your scriptures to keep your morale up." He went up the stairs to isolation, which had now apparently taken over most of the first floor. "Here you are," the nurse said. It was the pretty blonde student nurse again. He wondered if he should warn her about Mrs. Gadsden. "I'd nearly given you up," she said. "He's been calling for you all morning." She handed him a set of SPGs, and he put them on and followed her in. "He was frantic for you half an hour ago," she whispered. "Kept insisting he had something to tell you. He's a bit better now. He looked, in fact, considerably better. He had lost the dark, frightening flush, and though he was still a bit pale under his brown skin, he looked almost like his old self. He was sitting against several pillows, his knees up and his hands lying lightly on them. The fingers curved, his eyes were closed. "Bardry," the nurse said, putting her in perm, gloved hand on his shoulder and bending close to him. "Mr. Dunworth is here." He opened his eyes. "Mr. Dunworthy." "Yes," she nodded across the bed, indicating him. "I told you he'd come." Driss sat up straighter against the pillows, but he didn't look at Dunworthy. He looked intently ahead. "I'm here," Bardry Dunworthy said, moving forward so he was in his line of vision. "What was it you wanted to tell me?" Bardry continued to look straight ahead, and his hands began moving restlessly on his knees. Dunworthy glanced at the nurse. "He's been doing that," she said. "I think he's typing." She looked at the screens and went out. He was typing. His wrists rested on his knees, and his fingers tapped the blanket in a complex sequence. His eyes stared at something in front of him, a screen, and after a moment he frowned. "That can't be right," he said, and began typing rapidly. "What is it, Bardelli?" Dunworthy said, "What's wrong? There must be an error." Bardelli said. He leaned slightly sideways and said, "Give me a line by line on the TAA." He was speaking into the console's ear. Dunworthy realized he's reading the fix. He thought, "What can't be right, Bardry?" "The slippage." Bardry said, his eyes fixed on the imaginary screen. "Read out check," he said into the ear. "That can't be right." "What's wrong with the slippage?" Dunworthy asked. "Was there more slippage than you expected?" But Reed didn't answer. He typed for a moment, paused watching the screen, and began typing frantically. "How much slippage was there, Bardry?" Dunworthy said. He typed for a full minute, and then stopped and looked up at Dunworthy. "So worried," he said thoughtfully, worried over what Bardry Dunworthy said. Patrice suddenly flung the blanket back and grabbed for the bedrails. "I have to find Mr. Dunworthy," he said. He yanked at his cannula, pulling at the tape. The screens behind him went wild, spiking crazily and beeping. Somewhere outside an alarm went off. "You mustn't do that," Dunworthy said, reaching across the bed to stop him. "He's at the pub," Bardry said. Ripping at the tape, the screens went abruptly flat. "Line. Disconnect," a computer voice said. "Disconnect." The nurse banged an "Oh dear, that's twice he's done that." She said, "Mr. Child, hurry. You mustn't do that. You'll pull your cannula out. Go and get Mr. Dunworthy now." He said, "There's something wrong," but he lay back and let her cover him up. "Why doesn't he come?" Dan Worthy waited while the nurse retaped the cannula and reset the screens, watching Bardry. He looked worn out and apathetic, almost bored. A new bruise was already forming above the cannula. The nurse left with, "I think I'd best call down for sedative." As soon as she was gone, Dunworthy said, "Bettery, it's Mr. Dunworthy. You wanted to tell me something." "Look at me, Bettery. What is it? What's wrong?" Bettery looked at him, but without interest. "Was there too much slippage?" "Bettery, is Kevin in the plague?" "I don't have time," Battery said. "I was out there Saturday and Sunday." He began typing again, his fingers moving ceaselessly on the blanket. "That can't be right." The nurse came back with a drip bottle. "Oh, good," he said, and his expression relaxed and softened, as if a great weight had been lifted. "I don't know what happened. I had such a terrific headache." He closed his eyes before she had even hooked the drip to the cannula and began to snore softly. The nurse let him out. "If he wakes and calls for you again, where can you be reached?" she asked. He gave her the number. "What exactly did he say?" he asked. "Stripping off his gown before I arrived. He kept calling your name and saying he had to find you, that he had to tell you something important." "Did you say anything about rats?" He said no. "Once he said he had to find Karen or Catherine." "Kevin?" She nodded yes. "He said I must find Kevin. Is the laboratory open?" And then he said something about a lamb, but nothing about rats. "I don't think a good deal at the time. I can't make it out." He threw the impermeable gloves into the bag. "I want you to write down everything." He says not the unintelligible parts, he added before she could object. "But everything else. I'll be back this afternoon." "I'll try," she said. "It's mostly nonsense." He went downstairs. It was mostly nonsense, feverish ramblings that meant nothing. But he went outside to get a taxi. He wanted to get back to Balliol quickly, to speak to Andrews, to get him up here to read the fix. "That can't be right," Bettery had said, and it had to be the slippage. Could he have somehow misread the figure? Thought it was only for hours, and then discovered what? That it was for years, or 28. "You'll get there faster walking," someone said. It was the boy with the black face plasters. "If you're waiting for a taxi, you'll stand there forever. They've all been commandeered by the bloody government." He gestured toward one, just pulling up to the door of casualties. It had an NHS placard in the side window. Dunworthy thanked the boy and started back to Balliol. It was raining again, and he walked rapidly, hoping that Andrews had already telephoned, that he was already on his way. "Go and get Mr. Dunworthy immediately." Bettery had said now there's something wrong, and he was obviously reliving his actions after he had got the fix, when he had run through the rain to the lamb and crossed to fetch him. "That can't be right," he had said. He ran across the quad and up to his rooms. He was worried Miss Taylor wouldn't have been able to hear the telephone's bell over her bell ringers clanging. But when he opened the door, he found them standing in a circle, in the middle of his sitting room, in their face masks, their arms raised and hands folded, as if in supplication, bringing their hands down in front of them and bending their knees, one after the other in solemn silence. "Mr. Basingami's scout called," Miss Taylor said, rising and stooping. He said he thought Mr. Basingami was somewhere in the Highlands, and Mr. Andrews said you were to call him back. He just called. Dunworthy put the trunk core through, feeling immensely relieved, while he waited for Andrews to answer. He watched the curious dance and tried to determine the pattern. Miss Taylor seemed to bob on a semi-regular basis, but the others did their odd curtsies in no order. He could detect the largest one. Miss Pontini was counting to herself, frowning in concentration. "I've obtained clearance for you to enter the quarantine area. When are you coming up?" he said, as soon as the tech answered. "That's the thing, sir." Andrews said there was a visual, but it was too fuzzy to read his expression. "I don't think I'd better. I've been watching all about the quarantine on the vid." "Sir, they say this Indian flu is extremely dangerous. You needn't come in contact with any of the cases," Dunworthy said. "I can arrange for you to go straight to Brasenoses Laboratory. You'll be perfectly safe. This is extremely important." "Yes, sir. But the Vitters say it might have been caused by the university's heating system." "The heating system," Dunworthy said. "The university has no heating system, and the individual ones of the colleges are over 100 years old and incapable of heating, let alone infecting." The bell ringers turned as one to look at him, but they did not break rhythm. "It has absolutely nothing to do with the heating system, or India or the wrath of God. It began in South Carolina. The vaccine is already on the way. It's perfectly safe." Andrews looked stubborn. "Nevertheless, sir, I don't think it would be wise for me to come." The bell ringers abruptly stopped. "Sorry," Miss Pontini said, and they started again. "This fix must be read. We have an historian in 1320, and we don't know how much slippage there's been." "I'll see to it you're paid for hazardous duty," Dunworthy said, and then realized that was exactly the wrong approach. "I can arrange for you to be isolated or wear SPGs, or I could read the fix from here." Andrew said, "I've a friend who'll set up the access connections. She's a student at Shrewsbury." He paused. "It's the best I can do, sorry." "Sorry," Miss Pontini said again. No, you ring in second place," Miss Taylor said. "You dodge to 3, up and down, and 3 for down, and then lead a whole pull, and keep your eyes on the other ringers. Not on the floor. 1, 2, and off." They started their minuet again. "I simply can't take the risk," Andrews said. It was clear he couldn't be persuaded. "What is the name of your friend at Shrewsbury?" Dunworthy asked. "Polly Wilson," Andrews said. Sounding relieved, he gave Dunworthy her number. "Tell her you need a remote read, 1A inquiry and bridge transmit. I'll stay by this number." He moved to ring off. "Wait," Dunworthy said. The bell ringers glanced disapprovingly at him. "What would the maximal slippage be on a drop to 1320? "I've no idea," Andrew said promptly. "Slippage is difficult to predict. There are so many factors. An estimate," Dunworthy said. "Could it be 28 years? 28 years, Andrews said, and the amazed tone sent a gust of relief through Dunworthy. "I wouldn't think so. There's a general tendency toward greater slippage the farther back you go, but the increase isn't exponential. The parameter checks will tell you." Medieval didn't do any. They sent an historian back. "Without perimeter checks," Andrew sounded shocked. "Without parameter checks, without unmans, without recon tests," Dunworthy said. "Which is why it's essential I get this fix read." "I want you to do something for me." Andrews stiffened. "You don't have to come here to do it," he said rapidly. "Jesus has an on-site setup in London. I want you to go over there and run parameter checks. On a drop to noon 13th of December 1320. What are the local coordinates?" "I don't know. I'll get them when I go to Brasenose. I want you to telephone me here as soon as you've determined maximal slippage." "Could you do that?" "Yes," he said, but he was looking doubtful again. "Good. I'll telephone Polly Wilson. Remote read 1A inquiry bridge transmit. I'll ring you back as soon as she's got it set up at Brasenose," Dunworthy said, and rang off before Andrews could renege. He held on to the receiver, watching the bell ringers. The order changed each time, but Miss Pontini apparently did not lose count. Again, he telephoned Polly Wilson and gave her the specifications Andrews had dictated, wondering if she had been watching the Vitters too, and would be afraid of Brasenose's heating system. But she said promptly, "I'll need to find a gateway. I'll meet you there in 3/4 of an hour." He left the bell ringer still barbing and went over to Brazeau. The rain had slowed again, and there were more people on the streets, though many of the shops were closed. Whoever was in charge of the Carfax Carillon had either come down with the flu or forgotten about it because of the quarantine. It was still playing Bring a Torch, Jeanette Isabella, or possibly O Tenenbaum. There were 3 picketers outside an Indian grocer's, and a half dozen more outside Brazone's, with a large banner they were holding between them that read "Time travel is a health threat." He recognized the young woman on the end as one of the medics from the ambulance, heating systems, and the EC and time travel. During the pandemic, it had been the American germ warfare program and air conditioning. Back in the Middle Ages, they had blamed Satan and the appearance of comets for their epidemics, doubtless when the fact that the virus had originated in South Carolina was revealed, the Confederacy or Southern Fried Chicken would be blamed. He went in the gate to the porter's desk. The Christmas tree was sitting on one end of it, the angel perched atop it. "I have a student from Shrewsbury meeting me to set up some communications equipment," he told the porter. "We'll need to be let into the laboratory." "The laboratory is restricted, sir," the porter said. "Restricted? Yes, sir. It's been locked and no one's allowed in." "Why, what's happened?" "It's because of the epidemic, sir." "Epidemic?" "Yes, sir." "Perhaps you'd better speak with Mr. Gilchrist, sir. Perhaps I had tell him I'm here, and I need to be let into the laboratory." "I'm afraid he's not here just now." "Where is he?" "At the infirmary, I believe he darned well." They didn't wait to hear the rest. Halfway to the infirmary, it occurred to him that Polly Wilson would be left waiting, with no idea where he'd gone, and as he came up to the hospital, it came to him that Gilchrist might be there. Because he'd come down with a virus. Good, he thought. It's what he deserves. Burglechrist was in the little waiting room, Hawley and Hardy wearing an NHS face mask, rolling up his sleeve. In preparation for the inoculation, a nurse was holding. "Your porter told me the laboratory is restricted," he said, stepping between them. "I need to get into it. I found a tech to do a remote fix. We need to set up transmission equipment. I'm afraid that's impossible." Gilchrist said the laboratory is under quarantine until the source of the virus is determined. "The source of the virus?" he said incredulously. "The virus originated in South Carolina. We will not be certain of that until we have obtained positive identification. Until then, I felt it was best to minimize all possible risk to the university by restricting access to the laboratory now. If you will excuse me, I'm here to receive my immune system enhancement." He started past Dunworthy toward the nurse. Dunworthy put out his arm to stop him. "What risks?" "There has been considerable public concern that the virus was transmitted through the net." "Public concern? Do you mean those 3 half-wits with the banner outside your gate?" he shouted. "This is a hospital, Mr. Dunworthy." The nurse said, "Please keep your voice down." He ignored her. "There has been considerable public concern, as you call it, that the virus was caused by liberal immigration laws," he said. "Do you intend to succeed from the EC as well?" Gilchrist's chin went up, and the pinched lines appeared by his nose, visible even through the mask. "As acting head of the history faculty, it is my responsibility to act in the university's interest. Our position in the community, as I'm certain you're aware, depends on maintaining the goodwill of the townspeople. I felt it important to calm the public's fears by closing the laboratory until the sequencing arrives. If it indicates that the virus is from South Carolina, then of course the laboratory will be reopened immediately. And in the meantime, what about Kevin?" "If you cannot keep your voice down," the nurse said, "I shall be forced to report you to Dr. Ahrens." "Excellent, go and fetch her." Dunworthy told her, "I want her to tell Mr. Gilchrist how ridiculous he's being. This virus cannot possibly have come through the net." The nurse stamped out. "If your protesters are too ignorant to understand the laws of physics," Dunworthy said, "surely they can understand the simple fact that this was a drop. The net was only open to 1320, not from it. Nothing came through from the past. If that is the case, then Miss Engel is not in any danger, and it will do no harm to wait for the sequencing." Not in any danger. You don't even know where she is. Your tech obtained the fix and indicated the drop was successful and that there was minimal slippage. Gilchrist said. He rolled down his sleeve and carefully buttoned the cuff. I'm satisfied Miss Engel is where she's supposed to be. Well, I'm not. And I won't be until I know Kivrin made it through safely. I see I must remind you again that Miss Engel is my responsibility, not yours, Mr. Dunworthy. He donned his coat. I must do as I think best. And you think it best to set up a quarantine around the laboratory, to placate a handful of crackpots, he said bitterly. There is also considerable public concern that the virus is a judgment from God. What do you intend to do? To maintain the goodwill of those townspeople. Resume burning martyrs at the stake. I resent that remark, and I resent your constant interference in matters which do not concern you. You have been determined from the first to undermine medieval, to keep it from gaining access to time travel, and now you are determined to undermine my authority. May I remind you that I am acting head of history in Mr. Basingham's absence, and as such, what you are is an ignorant, self-important fool who should never have been trusted with medieval, let alone Kivrin's safety. I see no reason to continue this discussion. Gilchrist said the laboratory is under quarantine. It will remain so until we obtain the sequencing. He walked out. Dunworthy started after him and nearly collided with Mary. She was wearing SPGs and reading a chart. And you will not believe what Gilchrist's done now. He said. A group of picketers convinced him the virus came through the net and he's barricaded the laboratory. She didn't say anything or even look up from the chart. Boudreau said this morning that the slippage figures can't be right. He said over and over there's something wrong. She looked up at him distractedly and back at the chart. I have a tech ready to read Kevin's fix remotely, but Gilchrist locked the doors. He said you must talk to him, telling the virus has been firmly established as originating in South Carolina. It hasn't. What do you mean it hasn't? Did the sequencing arrive? She shook her head. The WIC located their tech, but she's still running it. But her preliminary read indicates it's not the South Carolina virus. She looked up at him, and I know it's not. She looked back at the chart. The South Carolina virus had a 0 mortality rate. What do you mean? Has something happened to Barry? No, she said, shutting the chart and holding it to her chest. Beverly Breen. He must have looked blank. He had thought she was going to say Latimer, the woman with the lavender umbrella. She said and sounded angry. She died just now. Transcript from the Doomsday Book, 22nd of December 1320, old style. Inez's knee is worse. It's red and painful, an understatement. She screams when I try to touch it, and she can scarcely walk. I don't know what to do if I tell Lady Hermione. She put one of her poultices on it and make it worse. And Alois is distracted and obviously worried. Garwin still isn't back. He should have been home by noon yesterday. And when he hadn't shown up by Vespers, Eloise accused Amani of sending him to Oxford. I have sent him to Corsi, as I told you, Amani said defensively. No doubt the rain keeps him only to Corsi, Alois said angrily. Or have you sent him otherwhere for a new chaplain? Amani drew herself up. Father Roche is not fit to say the Christmas masses if Sir Bloquet and his company come. She said, would you be ashamed before Rosamond's fiancé? Eloise went absolutely white. Where have you sent him? I have sent him with a message to the bishop, saying that we are in sore need of a chaplain, she said. To Bath, Eloise said, and raised her hand as if she would strike her. Nay, only to Cirencester. The archdeacon was to lie at the abbey for Yule. I bade Garwin give him the message. One of his churchmen will bear it thence. Though certes, things go not so ill in Bath, that Garwin could not go thence himself without harm. Else my son would have quitted it. Your son will be ill. Pleased to find we have disobeyed him. He bade us and Garwin keep to the manor till he come. She still sounded furious, and as she lowered her hand, she clenched it into a fist, as if she would have liked to box him on his ears. The way she does Mazeries, but the color had come back in her cheeks. As soon as a mine is said Cirencester, and I think she was at least a little relieved. Certes things go not so ill in Bath, that Garwin could not go thence without harm. Almani said, but it's obvious Alois doesn't think he can. Is she afraid he'd ride into a trap, or that he might lead Lord Guillaume's enemies here? And are things going so ill that Guillaume can't quit? Bath, perhaps all three. Eloise has been to the door to look out into the rain, at least a dozen times this morning, and she's in as bad a temper as Rosamond was. In the woods, just now she asked Hermione if she was certain the Archdeacon was at Cirencester. She's obviously worried that, if he wasn't, Garwin will have taken the message into Bath himself. Her fear has infected everyone. Lady Almani has slunk off into a corner with her reliquary to pray Agnes whines, and Rosamond sits with her embroidery in her lap, staring blindly at it. Break. I took Agnes to Father Roche this afternoon. Her knee was much worse, she couldn't walk at all, and there was what looked like the beginning of a red streak. Above it I couldn't tell for certain. The entire knee is red and swollen, but I was afraid to wait. There was no cure for blood poisoning in 1320, and it's my fault her knee is infected. If I hadn't insisted on going to look for the drop, she wouldn't have fallen. I know, the paradoxes aren't supposed to let my presence here have any effect on what happens to the contempts, but I couldn't take that chance. I wasn't supposed to be able to catch anything either, so when Amani went up to the loft, I carried Agnes over to the church to ask him to treat her. It was pouring by the time we got there, but Agnes wasn't whining over getting wet, and that frightened me more than the red streak. The church was dark and smelled musty. I could hear Father Roche's voice from the front of the church, and it sounded like he was talking to someone. Lord Guillaume has still not arrived from Bath. I fear for his safety, he said. I thought perhaps Garwin had come back, and I wanted to hear what they said about the trial. So I didn't go forward. I stood there with Agnes in my arms and listened. It has rained these 2 days, Roche said, and there is a bitter wind from the west. We have had to bring the sheep in from the fields. After a minute of peering into the dark nave, straining to see, I finally made him out. He was on his knees in front of the rood screen, his big hands folded together in prayer. The steward's babe has a colic on the stomach and cannot keep his milk down. Tabor the cotter fares ill. He wasn't praying in Latin, and there was none of the priesthood wholly reformed. Sing-song chanting or the vicar's oratory in his voice. He sounded businesslike and matter-of-fact, the way I sound now talking to you. God was supposed to be very real to the contempts. In the 1300s, more vivid than the physical world they inhabited, Roche told me when I was dying. And that's what the contempts are supposed to have believed, that the life of the body is illusionary and unimportant, and the real life is that of the eternal soul. As if they were only visiting life, the way I am visiting this century. But I haven't seen much evidence of it. Eloise dutifully murmurs her Aves at Vespers and Matins, and then rises and brushes off her kerchief, as if her prayers had nothing to do with her worries over her husband or the girls, or Garwin and amity for all. Her reliquary and her book of hours is concerned only about her social standing. I'd seen no evidence that God was real at all to them, till I stood there in the damp church, listening to Father Roche. I wonder if he sees God in heaven as clearly as I can see you in Oxford. The rain falling in the quad, and your spectacles steaming up, so you have to take them off and polish them. On your muffler, I wonder if they seem as close as you do, and as difficult to get to. Preserve our souls from evil, and bring us safely into heaven, Roche said, and as if that were a cue. Agnes sat up in my arms and said, "I want Father Roach." Father Roach stood up and started toward us. "What is it? Who's there?" "It is Lady Catherine," the first said. "I have brought Agnes. Her knee is what infected." "I would have you look at her knee." He tried to look at it, but it was to darken the church, so he carried her over to his house. It was scarcely lighter there. His house is not much larger than the hut I took shelter in, and no higher. He had to stoop the whole time we were there. To keep from bumping his head against the rafters, he opened the shutter on the only window, which let the rain blow in, and then lit a rushlight, and set Agnes on a crude wooden table. He untied the bandage, and she flinched away from him. "Sit you still, Agnes," he told her, "and I will tell you how Christ came to earth from far heaven on Christmas Day," Agnes said. Roach felt around the wound, poking at the swollen parts, talking steadily, and the shepherds stood afraid, for they knew not what this glittering light was, and sounds they heard as of bells rung in heaven. But they beheld it was God's angel come down to them. Agnes had screamed and pushed my hands away when I tried to touch her knee, but she let Roach prod the red area with his huge fingers. There was definitely the beginnings of a red streak. Roach touched it gently and brought the rushlight closer. "And there came from a far land," he said, squinting at it, "3 kings bearing gifts." He touched the red streak again gingerly, and then folded his hands together as if he were going to pray. And I thought, "Don't pray, do something." He lowered his hands and looked across at me. "I fear the wound is poisoned," he said. "I will make an infusion of hyssop to draw the venom out." He went over to the hearth, stirred up a few lukewarm-looking coals, and poured water into an iron pot from a bucket. The bucket was dirty, the pot was dirty. The hands he'd felt Agnes's wound with were dirty. And standing there, watching him set the pot on the fire and dig into a dirty bag, I was sorry I'd come. He wasn't any better than Amaryllis. An infusion of leaves and seeds wouldn't cure blood poisoning any more than one of Amaryllis' potencies, and his prayers wouldn't help either. Even if he did talk to God as if he were really there, I almost said, "Is that all you can do?" And then realized I was expecting the impossible. The cure for infection was penicillin, T-cell enhancement antiseptics, none of which he had in his burlap bag. I remember Mr. Gilchrist talking about medieval doctors in one of his lectures. He talked about what fools they were for bleeding people and treating them with arsenic and goat's urine during the Black Death. But what did he expect them to do? They didn't have analogs or antimicrobials. They didn't even know what caused it, standing there crumbling, dried petals and leaves between his dirty fingers. Father Roach was doing the best he could. "Do you have wine?" I asked him. "Old wine." There's scarcely any alcohol in the small ale, and not much more in their wine, but the longer it stood, the higher the alcoholic content, and alcohol is an antiseptic. I have remembered me that old wine poured into a wound may sometimes stop infections, I said. He didn't ask me what infection was, or how I was able to remember that. When I supposedly can't remember anything else, he went immediately across to the church and got an earthenware bottle full of strong-smelling wine, and I poured it onto the bandage and washed the wound with it. I brought the bottle home with me. I've hidden it under the bed in Rosamond's bower. In case it's part of the sacramental wine, that would be all Amaryllis would need. She'd have Roach burned for a heretic, so I can keep cleaning it. Before she went to bed, I poured some straight on. Chapter 19. It rained till Christmas Eve, a hard wintry rain. That came through the smoke vent in the roof and made the fire hiss and smoke. Kivrin poured wine on Agnes's knee at every chance she got, and by the afternoon of the 23rd, it looked a little better. It was still swollen, but the red streak was gone. Kevin ran across to the church, holding her cloak over her head to tell Father Roach, but he wasn't there, neither Amaryllis. nor Eloise had noticed Agnes's knee was hurt. They were trying frantically to get ready for Sir Bloet's family, if they were coming, cleaning the loft room so the women could sleep there, strewing rose petals over the rushes in the hall, baking an amazing assortment of manquettes, puddings and pies, including a grotesque one, in the shape of the Christ child, in the manger, with braided pastry for swaddling clothes. In the afternoon, Father Roach came to the manor drenched and shivering. He had gone out in the freezing rain to fetch ivy for the hall. Hermione wasn't there. She was in the kitchen cooking the Christ child, and Kivrin made Roach come in and dry his clothes. By the fire, she called for Maisry, and when she didn't come, went out across the courtyard to the kitchen and fetched him a cup of hot ale. When she returned with it, Maisry was on the bench beside Roach, holding her tangled filthy hair back with her hand, and Roach was putting goose grease on her ear. As soon as she saw Kevin, she clapped her hand to her ear, probably undoing all the good of Roca's treatment, and scuttled out. Agnes's knee is better, Kevin told him. The swelling has gone down and a new scab is forming. He didn't seem surprised, and she wondered if she'd been mistaken. If it hadn't been blood poisoning at all. During the night the rain turned to snow. They will not come, Lady Eloise said the next morning. Sounding relieved, Kevin had to agree with her. It had snowed nearly 30 centimeters in the night, and it was still coming down steadily. Even Amani seemed resigned to their not coming, though she kept on with the preparations, bringing down pewter trenches from the loft and shouting for Maisry. Around noon the snow stopped abruptly, and by 2 it had begun to clear, and Eloise ordered everyone into their good clothes. Kevin dressed the girls, surprised at the fanciness of their silk shifts. Agnes had a dark red velvet kerchief to wear over hers, and her silver buckle, and Rosamond's leaf green kerchief had long, split sleeves and a low bodice that showed the embroidery on her yellow shift. Nothing had been said to Kivrin about what she should wear, but after she had taken the girls' hair out of braids and brushed it over their shoulders, Agnes said, "You must put on your blue," and got her dress out of the chest at the foot of the bed. It looked less out of place among the girls' finery, but the weave was still to fine the color to blue. She didn't know what she should do about her hair. Unmarried girls wore their hair unbound, on festive occasions held back by a fillet or a ribbon. But her hair was too short for that, and only married women covered their hair. She couldn't just leave it uncovered. The chopped-off hair looked terrible. Apparently Eloise agreed. When Kivrin brought the girls back downstairs, she bit her lip and sent Maisry up to the loft room to fetch a thin, nearly transparent veil that she fastened with Kivrin's fillet halfway back on her head so that her front hair showed, but the ragged cut ends were hidden. Eloise's nervousness seemed to have returned. With the improving weather, she started when Maisry came in from outside, and then cuffed her for getting mud on the floor. She suddenly thought of a dozen things that weren't ready, and found fault with everyone. When Lady Armani said for the dozenth time, "If we had gone to Courcy," Alois nearly snapped her head off. Kevin had thought it was a bad idea to dress Agnes before the last possible minute, and by mid-afternoon, the little girl's embroidered sleeves were grubby, and she had spilled flour all down one side of the velvet skirt. By late afternoon, Garwin had still not returned. Everyone's nerves were at the snapping point, and Macy's ears were bright red. When Lady Amani told Kivrin to take 6 beeswax candles to Father Roach, she was delighted with the chance to get the girls out of the house. "Tell him they must last through both the masses," Amani said irritably. "And poor masses will they be for our Lord's birth. We should have gone to Courcy." Kevin got Agnes into her cloak and called Rosamond, and they walked across to the church. Roach wasn't there. A large, yellowish candle with bands marked on it sat in the middle of the altar unlit. He would light it at sunset and use it to keep track of the hours till midnight. On his knees in the icy church. He wasn't in his house either. Kivrin left the candles on the table. On the way back across the green, they saw Roach's donkey by the lich gate. Licking the snow, we forgot to feed the animals. Agnes said, "Feed the animals." Kevin asked wearily, thinking of their clothes. "It is Christmas Eve," Agnes said. "Fed you not the animals at home?" She remembers not. Rosamond said, "On Christmas Eve, we feed the animals in honor of our Lord, that he was born in a stable." "Do you remember naught of Christmas then?" Agnes asked. "A little," Kevin said. Thinking of Oxford on Christmas Eve, of the shops in Carfax, decorated with plastic evergreens and laser lights, and jammed with last-minute shoppers, the high full of bicycles. A Magdalen tower showing dimly through the snow. First they ring the bells, and then you get to eat, and then Mass, and then the Yule-log. Agnes said, "You have turned it all about." Rosamond said, "First we light the Yule-log, and then we go to Mass, first the bells." Agnes said, glaring at Rosamond, "And then Mass." They went to the barn for a sack of oats and some hay, and took them across to the stable to feed the horses. Gringolet wasn't among them, which meant Garwin still wasn't back. She must speak with him as soon as he returned. The rendezvous was less than a week away, and she still had no idea where the drop was. And with Lord Guillaume coming, everything might change. Eloise had only put off doing anything with her, till her husband came, and she had told the girls again this morning. She expected him today. He might decide to take Kivrin to Oxford, or London to look for her family, or Sir Bloet might offer to take her back with them. To Courcy, she had to talk to him soon, but with guests here, it would be much easier to catch him alone, and in all the bustle and business of Christmas. She might even get him to show her the place. Kevin dawdled as long as she could with the horses, hoping Garwin might come back, but Agnes got bored, and wanted to go feed corn to the chickens. Kevin suggested they go feed the steward's cow. "It is not our cow," Rosamond snapped. "She helped me on that day when I was ill," Kevin said, thinking of how she had leaned against the cow's bony. "Back the day she tried to find the drop, I would thank her for her kindness." They went past the pen where the pigs had lately been, and Agnes said, "Poor piglings, I would have fed them an apple." The sky to the north darkens again. Rosamond said, "I think they will not come." But they will." Agnes said, "So Bloet has promised me a trinket." The steward's cow was in almost the same place. Kevin had found it behind the second to the last hut, eating what was left of the same blackening pea vines. "Good Christmas, lady cow," Agnes said, holding a handful of hay. "A good meter from the cow's mouth." "They speak only at midnight," Rosamond said. "I would come see them at midnight." "Lady Kivrin," Agnes said. The cows strained forward. Agnes edged back. "You cannot, Simplehead." Rosamond said, "You will be at Mass." The cow extended her neck and took a large, hoofed step forward. Agnes retreated. Kivrin gave the cow a handful of hay. Agnes watched enviously. "If all are at Mass, how do they know the animals speak?" she asked. Good point, Kevin thought. "Father Roach says it is so," Rosamond said. Agnes came out from behind Kevin's skirts and picked up another handful of hay. "What do they say?" She pointed it in the cow's general direction. "They say you know not how to feed them." Rosamond said, "They do not," Agnes said, thrusting her hand forward. The cow lunged for the hay, mouth open, teeth bared. Agnes threw the handful of hay at it and ran behind Kevin's back. "They praise our blessed Lord," Father Roach said it. There was a sound of horses. Agnes ran between the huts. "They are come," she shouted. "Running back, Sir Bloet is here. I saw them, they ride now through the gate." Kevin hastily scattered the rest of the hay in front of the cow. Rosamond took a handful of oats out of the bag and fed them to the cow, letting it nuzzle the grain out of her open hand. "Come, Rosamond," Agnes said. "Bloet is here." Rosamond rubbed what was left of the oats off her hand. "I would feed Father Roche's donkey," she said, and started toward the church, not even glancing in the direction of the manor. "But they've come," Rosamond, Agnes shouted, running after her. "Do you not want to see what they have brought?" Obviously not. Rosamond had reached the donkey, which had found a tuft of foxtail grass sticking out of the snow next to the lich gate. She bent and stuck a handful of oats under its muzzle, to its complete disinterest, and then stood there with her hand on its back, her long dark hair hiding her face. "Rosamond," Agnes said, her face red with frustration. "Did you not hear me? They have come." The donkey nudged the oats out of the way and clamped its yellow teeth around a large head of the grass. Rosamond continued to offer at the oats. "Rosamond," Kevin said, "I will feed the donkey. You must go to greet your guests." "Sir Bloet said he would bring me a trinket," Agnes said. Rosamond opened our hands and let the oats fall. "If you like him so well, why do you not ask Father to let you marry him?" she said, and started for the manor. "I'm too little," Agnes said. "So is Rosamond," Kevin thought, grabbing Agnes's hand and starting after her. Rosamond walked rapidly ahead, her chin in the air, not bothering to lift her dragging skirts, ignoring Agnes's repeated pleas to wait. Rosamond. The party had already passed into the courtyard, and Rosamond was already to the sty. Kevin picked up the pace, pulling Agnes along at a run, and they all arrived in the courtyard at the same time. Kevin stopped, surprised. She had expected a formal meeting, the family at the door, with stiff speeches and polite smiles. But this was like the first day of term, everyone carrying in boxes and bags, greeting each other with exclamations and embraces, talking at the same time, laughing. Rosamond hadn't even been missed. A large woman wearing an enormous starched coif grabbed Agnes up and kissed her, and 3 young girls clustered around Rosamond, squealing. Servants, obviously in their holiday best too, carried covered baskets and an enormous goose into the kitchen, and led the horses into the stable. Garwin, still on Gringle, was leaning down to speak to Amani. Kevin heard him say, "Nay, the bishop is at Wivelscombe," but Ermin didn't look unhappy, so he must have got the message to the archdeacon. She turned to help a young woman in a vivid blue cloak, even brighter than Kevin's kerchief, down from her horse and led her over to Eloise, smiling. Eloise was smiling too. Kevin tried to make out which was Subloit, but there were at least a half-dozen mounted men, all with silver chased bridles and fur-trimmed cloaks. None of them looked decrepit, thank goodness, and 1 or 2 were quite presentable looking. She turned to ask Agnes which one he was, but she was still in the grip of the starched coif, who kept patting her head and saying, "You have grown so I scarce knew you." Kevin stifled a smile. Some things truly never changed. Several of the newcomers had red hair, including a woman nearly as old as Amani, who nevertheless wore her faded pink hair down her back like a young girl. She had a pinched, unhappy-looking mouth and was obviously dissatisfied with the way the servants were unloading things. She snatched 1 overloaded basket out of the hands of a servant who was struggling with it and thrust it at a fat man in a green velvet kerchief. He had red hair too, and so did the nicest looking of the younger men. He was in his late 20s, but he had a round, open, freckled face and a pleasant expression, at least. So Bloet, Agnes cried, and flung herself past Kevin and against the knees of the fat man. Oh no, Kevin thought. She had assumed the fat man was married to the pink trussed shrew or the woman in the starched quiff. He was at least 50 and nearly 20 stone, and when he smiled at Agnes, his large teeth were brown with decay. "Have you no trinket for me?" Agnes was demanding. Tugging on the hem of his kerchief, he said, looking toward where Rosamond still stood, talking to the other girls, "For you and for your sister." "I'll fetch her," Agnes said, and darted across to Rosamond. Before Kivrin could stop her, Bloet lumbered after her. The girls giggled and parted as he approached, and Rosamond shot a murderous look at Agnes, and then smiled and extended her hand to him. "Good day and welcome, sir," she said. Her chin was up about as far as it would go, and there were just spots of feverish red in her pale cheeks, but Blowett apparently took these for shyness and excitement. He took her little fingers in his own fat ones and said, "Surely you will not greet your husband with such formality. Come spring, the spots got redder." "It is still winter, sir. It will be spring soon enough," he said and laughed, showing his brown teeth. "Where's my trinket?" Agnes demanded. "Agnes, be not so greedy," Eloise said, coming to stand between her daughters. "It is a poor welcome to demand gifts of a guest." She smiled at him, and if she dreaded this marriage, she showed no sign of it. She looked more relaxed than Kevin had yet seen her. "I promised my sister-in-law a trinket," he said, reaching into his too-tight belt and bringing out a little cloth bag, "and my betrothed a bride gift." He fumbled in the little bag and brought out a brooch. "Set with stones, a love knot for my bride," he said. Unfastening the clasp, "You must think of me when you wear it." He moved forward, puffing, to pin it to her cloak. "I hope he has a stroke," Kevin thought. Rosamond stood stock still, her cheeks sharply red, while his fat hands fumbled at her neck. "Rubies," Alois said delightedly. "Do you not thank your betrothed for this goodly gift, Rosamond?" "I thank thee for the brooch," Rosamond said tonelessly. "Where's my trinket?" Agnes said, dancing on one foot, then the other, while he reached in the little bag again and brought out something. Clenched in his fist, he stooped down to Agnes's level, breathing hard, and opened his hand. "It is a bell," Agnes said delightedly, holding it up and shaking it. It was brass and round like a horse's sleigh bell, and had a metal loop at the top. Agnes insisted on Kivrin taking her up to the bower to fetch a ribbon to thread through it, so she could wear it around her wrist for a bracelet. "My father brought me this ribbon from the fair," Agnes said, pulling it out of the chest Kivrin's clothes had been kept in. It was patchily dyed and so stiff, Kivrin had trouble threading it through the hole. Even the cheapest ribbons of Woolworths, or the paper ribbons used for wrapping Christmas presents, were better than this obviously treasured one. Kevin tied it to Agnes's wrist, and they went back. Downstairs, the bustle and unloading had moved inside, servants carrying chests and bedding, and what looked like early versions of the carpet bag, into the hall. Sheninde worried about Sir Blowett all carrying her off. It looked like they were here for the winter at least. She needn't have worried about them discussing her fate either. None of them had so much as cast a glance at her. Even when Agnes insisted on going over to her mother and showing off her bracelet, Eloise was deep in conversation with Blowett, Garwin, and the nice-looking man, who must be a son or a nephew, and Eloise was twisting her hands again. The news from Bath must be bad. Lady Amani was at the end of the hall, talking to the stout woman and a pale-looking man in a cleric's robe, and it was clear from the expression on her face that she was complaining about Father Roach. Kevin took advantage of the noisy confusion to pull Rosamond away from the other girls and ask her who everyone was. The pale man was Sir Blowett's chaplain, which she had more or less figured out. The lady in the bright blue cloak was his foster daughter. The stout woman with a starched quiff was Sir Blowett's brother's wife, come up from Dorset to stay with him. The red-headed young men and the giggling girls were all hers. Sir Blowett didn't have any children, which of course was why he was marrying one, with apparently everyone's approval. The carrying on of the line was the all-important concern. In 1320, the younger the woman, the better her chance of producing enough heirs that one at least would survive to adulthood. Even if its mother didn't, the shrew with the faded red hair was. Horror of horrors, Lady Evolde, his unmarried sister. She lived at Courcy with him, and Kevin saw watching her, shouting at poor Maisry for dropping a basket, had a bunch of keys at her belt, That meant she ran the household, always until Easter. Poor Rosamond wouldn't stand a chance. Who are all the others, Kevin asked, hoping there might be at least one ally for Rosamond. Among them, servants, Rosamond said, as if it were obvious, and ran back to the girls. There were at least 20 of them, not counting the grooms who were putting the horses up. And nobody, not even the nervous Eloise, seemed surprised by their number. She had read that noble households had dozens of servants, but had thought those figures must be off. Eloise and Amani had scarcely any servants at all. Had to put practically the whole village to work to get ready for Yule, and although she had put part of it down to their being in trouble, she had also thought the numbers of attendants for the rural manors must have been exaggerated. They obviously weren't. The servants swarmed over the hall, serving supper. Kevin had not known whether they would eat an evening meal at all since Christmas Eve was a fast day, but as soon as the pale chaplain finished reading Vespers, obviously on Lady Amina's orders, the herd of servants trooped in with a meal of bread, watered wine, and dried cod that had been soaked in lye water and then roasted. Agnes was so excited she didn't eat a bite, and after supper had been cleared away, she refused to come and sit quietly by the hearth, but ran round the hall, ringing her bell and pestering the dogs. Sir Bloet's servants and the steward brought in the Yule log and dumped it on the hearth, scattering sparks everywhere. The women stepped back laughing, and the children screamed with delight. Rosamond, as eldest child of the house, lit the log with a faggot, saved from the Yule log the year before, touching it gingerly to the tip of one of the crooked roats. There was laughter and applause when it caught, and Agnes waved her arm wildly to make her bell ring. Rosamond had said earlier that the children were allowed to stay up for the Mass at midnight, but Kevin had hoped she could at least coax Agnes to lie down on the bench beside her and take a nap instead. As the evening progressed, Agnes got wilder and wilder, shrieking and ringing her bell, till Kevin had to take it away from her. The women sat down by the hearth talking quietly. The men stood in little groups, their arms folded across their chests, and several times they all went outside, except for the chaplain, and came back in, stamping the snow off their feet and laughing. It was obvious from their red faces and a man's look of disapproval that they had been out in the brewhouse with a keg of ale breaking their fast. When they came in the third time, Bloet sat down across the hearth and stretched out his legs to the fire, watching the girls, the three gigglers, and Rosamond were playing blind man's buff when Rosamond, blindfolded, came close to the benches. Bloet reached out and pulled her onto his lap. Everyone laughed. Imani spent the long evening sitting by the chaplain, reciting her grievances against Father Roach. To him, he was ignorant. He was clumsy. He had said the Confiteor before the Euchre during the Mass last Sunday, and he was out there in that ice-cold church, on his knees, Kevin thought, while the chaplain warmed his hands at the fire and shook his head disapprovingly. The fire died down to glowing embers. Rosamond slid off Bloet's lap and ran back to the game. Garwin told the story of how he had killed 6 wolves. Watching Eloise the whole time, the chaplain told a story about a dying woman who had made false confession. When the chaplain had touched her forehead with the holy oil, her skin had smoked and turned black before his eyes. Halfway through the chaplain's story, Darwin stood up, rubbed his hands over the fire, and went over to the beggar's bench. He sat down and pulled off his boot. After a minute, Eloise stood up and went over to him. Kevin couldn't hear what she said to him, but he stood up, the boot still in his hand. "The trial is once more delayed," Kevin heard Garwin say. "The judge who was to hear it is taken ill." She couldn't hear Eloise's answer, but Gawain nodded and said, "It is good news. The new judge is from Swindon, and less kindly disposed to King Edward." But neither of them looked like it was good news. Eloise was nearly as white as she had been. When Amani told her she'd sent Garwin to Corsi, she twisted her heavy ring. Garwin sat down again, brushed the rushes from the bottom of his hose, and pulled the boot on, and then looked up again and said something. Eloise turned her head aside, and Kevin couldn't see her expression for the shadows. But she could see Garwin's, and so could anyone else in the hall. Kivrin thought and looked hastily around to see if the couple had been observed. Armani was deep in complaint with the chaplain, but Sir Bloet's sister was watching, her mouth tight with disapproval, and so on the opposite side of the fire were Bloet and the other men. Kevin had hoped she might have a chance to speak with Garwin tonight, but she obviously could not. Among all these watchful people, a bell rang, and Eloise started and looked toward the door. "It is the devil's knell," the captain said quietly, and even the children stopped their games to listen. In some villages, the Contempts had rung the bell once for each year. Since the birth of Christ, in most, it had only been tolled for the hour before midnight, and Kevin doubted whether Roach or even the chaplain could count high enough to tell the years, but she began keeping count anyway. 3 servants came in bearing logs and kindling, and replenished the fire. It flared up brightly, throwing huge distorted shadows on the walls. Agnes jumped up and pointed, and one of Sir Bloet's nephews made a rabbit with his hands. Mr. Latimer told her that the Contempts had read the future in the Yule log's shadows. She wondered what the future held for them. Lord Guillaume in trouble and all of them in danger. The king had forfeited the lands and property of convicted criminals. They might be forced to live in France or to accept charity from Sir Bloet and endure snubs from the steward's wife, or Lord Guillaume might come home tonight with good news and a falcon for Agnes, and they would all live happily ever after, except Eloise and Rosamond. What would happen to her? It's already happened. Givrin thought wonderingly. The verdict is already in. Found out about Garwin and Eloise. Rosamond's already been handed over to Sir Bloet, and Agnes has grown up and married and died in childbirth, or of blood poisoning or cholera or pneumonia. They've all died, she thought, and couldn't make herself believe it. They've all been dead over 700 years. "Look," Agnes shrieked. "Rosamond has no head." She pointed to the distorted shadows. The fire cast on the walls. As it flared up, Rosamond's oddly elongated ended at the shoulders. One of the red-headed boys ran over to Agnes. "I have no head either," he said, jumping on tiptoe to change the shadow's shape. "You have no head, Rosamond." Agnes shouted happily. "You will die ere the year is out." "Say not such things," Eloise said. Starting to alter, everyone looked up. "Kevin has a head," Agnes said. "I have a head, but poor Rosamond has none." Eloise caught hold of Agnes by both arms. "Those are but foolish games." She said, "Say not such things." "The shadow," Agnes said, looking like she was going to cry. "Sit you down by Lady Catherine and be still," Eloise said. She brought her over to Kivrin and almost pushed her onto the bench. "You are grown too wild." Agnes huddled next to Kevin, trying to decide whether to cry or not. Kevin had lost count, but she picked up where she had left off. 46. "I want my bell," Agnes said. Climbing off the bench. "Nay, we must sit quietly," Kivrin said. She took Agnes onto her lap. "Tell me of Christmas." "I can't, Agnes. I can't remember." "Do you remember naught that you can tell me?" "I remember it all," Kivrin thought. "The shops are full of ribbons. Satin and mylar and velvet, red and gold and blue. Brighter even than my woe-dyed cloak. And there's light everywhere and music. Great Tom and Maudlin's bells and Christmas carollers." She thought of the Carfax carillon trying to play. It came upon the midnight clear, and the tired, old piped in carollers in the shops along the high. Those carols haven't even been written yet. Kevin thought and felt a sudden wash of homesickness. "I would ring my bell," Agnes said, struggling to get off Kiver's lap. "Give it to me." She held out her wrist. "I will tie it on. If you will lie down a little on the bench beside me." Kevin said. She started to pucker up into a pout again. "Must I sleep?" "No, I will tell you a story," Kevin said, untying the bell from her own wrist, where she had put it for safekeeping. "Once," she said, and then stopped, wondering if once upon a time dated as far back as 1320, and what sort of stories. The Contempts told their children stories about wolves and about witches, whose skin turned black when they were given extreme unction. There was once a maiden, she said, tying the bell on Inez's chubby wrist. The red ribbon had already begun to fray at the edges. It wouldn't tolerate many more knotting and unknotting. She bent over it. "A maiden who lived. Is this the maiden?" A woman's voice said. Kevin looked up. It was Bloet's sister Eva. With Imani behind her, she stared at Kevin, her mouth pinched with disapproval, and then shook her head. "Nay, this is not a Lorik's daughter." She said that maid was short and dark. "Nor the farrier's ward." Armani said, "She is dead." Ivolde said, "Do you remember naught of who you are?" She asked Kevin. "Nay, good lady." Kevin said, remembering, too late, that she was supposed to keep her eyes modestly. On the floor, she was struck upon the head. Agnes volunteered. "Yet you remember your name and how to speak. Are you of good family?" "I do not remember my family, good lady," Kevin said, trying to keep her voice meek. Ivolde sniffed. "She sounds of the West." "Have you sent to Bath for news?" "Nay," Amani said. "My son's wife would wait on his arrival." "You have heard naught from Oxenford?" "Nay, but there is much illness there." Ivolde said. Rosamond came up. "Know you Lady Catherine's family?" "Lady of Waldy?" she asked of Waldy. Turned her pinched look on her. "Nay." "Where's the brooch my brother gave you?" "It is on my cloak." Rosamond stammered. "Do you not honor his gifts enough to wear them?" "Go and fetch it, lady." Amani said, "I would see this brooch." Rosamond's chin went up, but she went over to the outer wall, where the cloaks hung. "She shows as little eagerness for my brother's gifts as for his presence." Ivolde said she spoke not once to him at supper. Rosamond came back, carrying her green cloak with the brooch pinned to it. She showed it wordlessly to Amani. "I would see it," Agnes said, and Rosamond bent down to show her. The brooch had red stones set on a round gold ring, and a pin in the center. It had no hinge, but had to be pulled up and stuck through the garment. Letters ran around the outside of the ring. "Iosusan Louis Damiamo." "What does it say?" Agnes said, pointing to the letters ringing the gold circle. "I know not," Rosamond said, in a tone that clearly meant, "and I don't care." Evoda's jaw tightened, and Kivrin said hastily, "It says you are here in place of the friend I love." Agnes, and then realized sickly what she had done. She looked up at Amani, but Amani didn't seem to have noticed anything. "Such words should be on your breast, instead of hanging on a peg." Amani said. She took the brooch and pinned it to the front of Rosamond's kirtle. "And you should be at my brother's side, as befits his betrothed," Avondale said, instead of playing childish games. She extended her hand in the direction of the hearth, where Blair was sitting nearly asleep, and obviously the worse for all the trips outside. And Rosamond looked beseechingly at Kevin. "Go and thank Sir Bloet for such a generous gift," Amani said coldly. Rosamond handed Kivrin her cloak and started toward the hearth. "Come, Agnes." Kivrin said, "You must rest." "I would listen to the devil's knell," Agnes said. "Lady Catherine," Ivolde said, and there was an odd emphasis on the word lady. "You told us you remembered." "Not yet. You read Lady Rosamond's brooch with ease." "Can you read then?" "I can read," Kevin thought, but fewer than 1/3 of the Contempts could, and even fewer of women. She glanced at Amani, who was looking at her the way she had the first morning she was here, fingering her clothes and examining her hands. "Number," Kevin said, looking at Voldy directly in the eye. "I fear I cannot read even the Paternoster. Your brother told us what the words meant when he gave the brooch to Rosamond." "Nay, he did not." Agnes said. You were looking at your bell, Gervin said, thinking. Lady Ofwaldi will never believe that. She asked him and he'll say he never spoke to me, but Ofwaldi seemed satisfied. I did not think such a one as she would be able to read. She said to Amani. She gave her her hand and they walked over to Sabloit. Kevin sank down on the bench. I would have my bell, Agnes said. I will not tie it on unless you lie down. Agnes crawled into her lap. You must tell me the story first. Once there was a maiden. Once there was a maiden, Kevin said. She looked at a man in Ivoldi. They had sat down next to Sploot and were talking to Rosamond. She said something, her chin up and her cheeks were red. Tablaoit laughed and his hand closed over the brooch and then slid down over Rosamond's breast. Once there was a maiden, Agnes said insistently, who lived at the edge of a great forest. Kevin said, do not go into the forest alone. Her father said, but she would not heed him. Agnes said, yawning, no, she wouldn't heed him. Her father loved her and cared only for her safety, but she wouldn't listen to him. What was in the woods? Agnes asked, nestling against Kevin. Kevin pulled Rosamond's cloak up over her. Cutthroats and thieves, she thought, and lecherous old men and their shrewish sisters, and illicit lovers and husbands and judges. All sorts of dangerous things. Wolves, Agnes said sleepily. Yes, wolves. She looked at Hermione and Ivoldi. They had moved away from Sabloit and were watching her, whispering, what happened to her? Agnes said sleepily, her eyes already closing. Kevin cradled her close. I don't know, she murmured. I don't know. Chapter 20. Agnes could not have been asleep. More than 5 minutes before the bell stopped, and then began to ring again. More quickly, calling them to Mass. Father Roach begins too soon. It is not midnight yet, Lady Amani said. And it wasn't even out of her mouth before the other bells started. Which laid and Burford and far away to the east. Too far to be more than a breath of an echo. The bells of Oxford. There are the Osney bells and there's Carfax, Kevin thought, and wondered if they were ringing at home tonight too. Sir Bloet heaved himself to his feet and then helped his sister up. One of their servants hurried in with their cloaks and a squirrel fur-lined mantle. The chattering girls pulled their cloaks from the pile and fastened them, still chattering. Lady Amani shook Maisie, who'd fallen asleep on the beggar's bench, and told her to fetch her book of hours. And Maisie shuffled off to the loft ladder, yawning. Rosamond came over and reached, with exaggerated carefulness, for her cloak, which had slid off on Inez's shoulders. Agnes was dead to the world. Kevin hesitated, hating to have to wake her up, but fairly sure, even exhausted. 5-year-olds weren't accepted from this mess, Agnes, she said softly. You must need to carry her to the church. Rosamond said, struggling with Sir Bloet's gold brooch. The steward's youngest boy came and stood in front of Kivrin with her white cloak, dragging it on the rushes. Agnes, Kevin said again, and jostled her, a little amazed that the church bell hadn't waked her. It sounded louder and closer than it ever did for matins or vespers, its overtones nearly drowning out the other bells. Inez's eyes flew open. You did not wake me, she said sleepily to Rosamond. And then more loudly as she came awake, you promised to wake me. Get into your cloak. Kevin said, we must go to church. Kevin, I would wear my bell. You're wearing it, Kevin said, trying to fasten Inez's red cape, without stabbing her in the neck, with the pin of the clasp. Nay, I have it not, Agnes said, searching her arm. I would wear my bell. Here it is, Rosamond said, picking it up off the floor. It must have fallen from your wrist. But it is not meet to wear it now. This bell causes to Mass. The Christmas bells come after. I shall not ring it, Agnes said. I would only wear it. Kevin didn't believe that for a minute, but everyone else was ready. One of Sir Bloet's men was lighting the horn lanterns with a brand from the fire and handing them to the servants. She hastily tied the bell to Inez's wrist and took the girls by the hand. Lady Eloise laid her hand on Sir Bloet's upheld one. Lady Amani signaled to Kivrin to follow with the little girls, and the others fell in behind them solemnly. As if it were a procession, Lady Amani was Sir Blowhat's sister, and then the rest of Sir Blowhat's entourage. Lady Alois and Sir Blowhat led the way out into the courtyard, through the gate and onto the green. It had stopped snowing and the stars had come out. The village lay silent under its covering of white, frozen in time-governed thought. The dilapidated buildings looked different. The staggering fences and filthy, daubed huts softened and graced by the snow. The lanterns caught the crystalline facets of the snowflakes and made them sparkle. But it was the stars that took Kevin's breath away. Hundreds of stars, thousands of stars, and all of them sparkling like jewels in the icy air. It shines, Agnes said. And Kevin didn't know whether she was talking about the snow or the sky. The bell tolled evenly, calmly. It sounded different again out in the frosty air. Not louder but fuller and somehow clearer. Kevin could hear all the other bells now, and recognize them, Escott and Whitney and Chertle in tone. Even though they sounded different too, she listened for the Swindon bell, which had rung all this time, but she couldn't hear it. She couldn't hear the Oxford bells either. She wondered if she had only imagined them. You are ringing your bell. Agnes Rosamond said, I am not. Agnes said, I'm only walking. Look at the church, Kevin said, isn't it beautiful? It flamed like a beacon at the other end of the green, lit from inside and out the stained glass windows, throwing wavering ruby and sapphire lights. On the snow, there were lights all around it too, filling the churchyard all the way to the bell tower. Torches, she could smell their tarry smoke. More torches made their way in from the white fields, winding down from the hill behind the church. She thought suddenly of Oxford on Christmas Eve, the shops lit for last-minute shopping, and the windows of Brasenose shining yellow onto the quad, and the Christmas tree at Balliol lit with multicolored strings of laser lights. I would that we had come to you for you well, Lady Amani said to Lady Evoldi. Then we had had a proper priest to say the masses. This place's priest can, but barely say the part of Neuster. This place's priest just spent hours kneeling in an ice-cold church, Kevin thought. Hours kneeling in holes that have holes in the knees. And now this place's priest is ringing a heavy bell. That has had to be tolled for an hour, and will shortly go through an elaborate ceremony that he has had to memorize because he cannot read. It will be a poor sermon and a poor mass, I fear. Lady Hermione said, Alas, there are many who do not love God in these days. Lady of Walder said, But we must pray to God that he will set the world right and bring men again to virtue. Kevin doubted if that answer was what Lady Amani wanted to hear. I have sent to the Bishop of Bath to send us a chaplain. Amani said, But he has not yet come. My brother says there is much trouble in Bath. Ivuldi said. They were almost to the churchyard. Kevin could make out faces now, lit by the smoky torches and by little oil cressets. Some of the women were carrying. Their faces reddened and lit from below, looked faintly sinister. Mr. Dunworthy would think they were an angry mob. Kivrin thought, gathered to burn some poor martyr at the stake. It's the light, she thought. Everyone looks like a cutthroat by torchlight. No wonder they invented electricity. They came into the churchyard. Kivrin recognized some of the people near the church doors. The boy with the scurvy who had run from her. Two of the young girls who'd helped with the Christmas baking cob, the steward's wife, was wearing a cloak with an ermine collar and carrying a metal lantern. With for tiny panes of real glass, she was talking animatedly to the woman with the scrofular scars who had helped put up the holly. They were all talking and moving around to keep warm. And one man with a black beard was laughing so hard, his torch swept dangerously close to the steward's wife's wimple. Church officials had eventually had to do away with the midnight mass because of all the drinking and carousing, Kivrin remembered, and some of these parishioners definitely looked like they had spent the evening breaking fast. The steward was talking animatedly to a rough-looking man. Rosman pointed out as Matsari's father. Both their faces were bright red from the cold, or the torchlight, or the liquor. Or all three, but they seemed gay rather than dangerous. The steward kept punctuating what he was saying, with hard-funking claps on Mary's father's shoulder. And every time he did it, the father laughed. A happy, helpless giggle that made Kevin think. He was much brighter than she had supposed. The steward's wife grabbed for her husband's sleeve, and he shook her off, but as soon as Lady Eloise and Sir Bloet came through the lich gate, he and Misley's father fell back promptly to make a clear path into the church. So did all the others, falling silent as the entourage passed through the churchyard and in the heavy doors, and then beginning to talk again, but more quietly as they came into the church. Behind them, Sir Bloet unbuckled his sword and handed it to a servant, and he and Lady Eloise knelt and genuflected. As soon as they were in the door, they walked almost to the rood screen together and knelt again. Kivrin and the little girls followed. When Agnes crossed herself, her bell jangled hollowly in the church. I'll have to take it off of her, Kevin thought, and wondered if she should step out of the procession now and take Agnes off to the side by Lady Amani's husband's tomb and undo it. But Lady Amani was waiting impatiently at the door. With Sir Bloet's sister, she led the girls to the front. Sir Bloet had already lumbered to his feet again. Eloise stayed on her knees a little longer and then stood, and Sir Bloet escorted her to the north side of the church, bowed slightly, and walked over to take his place on the men's side. Kevin knelt with the little girls, praying Agnes wouldn't make too much noise. When she crossed herself again, she didn't, but when Agnes got to her feet, she snagged her foot in the hem of her robe and caught herself with a clanging, almost as loud as the bell still tolling outside. Lady Ehrman was, of course, right behind them. She glared at Kevin. Kevin took the girls to stand beside Eloise. Lady Ehrman knelt, but Lady Alvaldi made only an obsequiousness. As soon as Amani rose, a servant hurried forward with a dark, velvet-covered prie-dieu and laid it on the floor next to Rosamond, for Lady Evoldi to kneel on. Another servant had laid one in front of Sir Bloet, on the men's side, and was helping him get down on his knees on it. He puffed and clung to the servant's arm. As he lowered his bulk and his face got very red, Kivrin looked at Lady Evoldi's prie-dieu longingly, thinking of the plastic kneeling pads that hung on the backs of the chairs. In St. Mary's, she had never realized until now what a blessing they were. What a blessing the hard wooden chairs were either, until they stood again. And she thought about how they would have to remain. Standing through the whole service, the floor was cold, the church was cold. In spite of all the lights, they were mostly cressets set along the walls. And in front of the holly, banked statue of St. Catherine, though there was a tall, thin, yellowish candle set in the greenery of each of the windows, but the effect was probably not what Father Roach had intended. The bright flames only made the colored panes of glass darker, almost black. More of the yellowish candles were in the silver candelabra on either side of the altar, and holly was heaped in front of them and along the top of the rood screen, and Father Roach had set Lady Amina's beeswax candles in. Among the sharp, shiny leaves, he'd done a job of decorating the church. That should please even Lady Amaryllis, Kevin thought, and glanced at her. She was holding her reliquary between her folded hands, but her eyes were open, and she was staring at the top of the rood screen. Her mouth was tight with disapproval. And Kevin supposed she hadn't wanted the candles there, but it was the perfect place for them. They illuminated the crucifix and the Last Judgment and lit nearly the whole nave. They made the whole church seem different, homier, more familiar. Like St. Mary's on Christmas Eve, Dunworthy had taken her to the ecumenical service. Last Christmas, She had planned to go to midnight mass at the Holy Reform to hear it said in Latin, but there hadn't been a midnight mass. The priest had been asked to read the gospel for the ecumenical service, so he had moved the mass to 4 in the afternoon. Agnes was fiddling with her bell again. Lady Amani turned and glared at her across her piously folded hands, and Rosamond leaned across Kivrin and shushed her. "You mustn't ring your bell until the mass is over," Catherine whispered, bending close to Agnes so no one else could hear her. "I rang it not," Agnes whispered back, in a voice that could be heard all over the church. "The ribbon binds too tight. See you." Kevin couldn't see any such thing. In fact, if she had taken the time to tie it tighter, it wouldn't be ringing at every movement, but there was no way. She was going to argue with an overtired child. When the mass was going to begin any minute, she reached for the knot. Agnes must have been trying to pull the bell off over her wrist. The already fraying ribbon had tightened into a solid little knot. Kevin picked at its edges with her fingernails. Keeping an eye on the people behind her, the service would start with a procession. Father Roach and his acolytes, if he had any, would come down the aisle, bearing the holy water and chanting the asperges. Kevin pulled on the ribbon on both sides of the knot, tightening it beyond any hope of ever getting it off. Without cutting it, but getting a little more slack, it still wasn't enough to get the ribbon off. She glanced back at the church door. The bell had stopped, but there was still no sign of Father Roach, and no elf for him to come up either. The townsfolk had crowded in, filling the whole rear of the church. Someone had lifted a child up onto Amani's husband's tomb and was holding him there so he could see, but there wasn't anything to see yet. She went back to working on the bell. She got two fingers under the ribbon and pulled up on it, trying to stretch it. "Tear it not," Agnes said in that carrying stage whisper of hers. Kevin took hold of the bell and hastily pulled it around so it lay in Agnes' palm. "Hold it like this," she whispered, cupping Agnes' fingers over it tightly. Agnes obligingly clenched her little fist. Kevin folded Agnes's other hand over the top of the fist in a so facile of a praying attitude and said softly, "Hold tight to the bell and it will not ring." Agnes promptly pressed her hands to her forehead in an attitude of angelic piety. "Good girl," Kevin said, and put her arm around her. She glanced back at the church doors. They were still closed. She breathed a sigh of relief and turned back to face the altar. Father Roach was standing there. He was dressed in an embroidered white stole and a yellowed white alb, with a hem more frayed than Agnes's ribbon, and was holding a book. He had obviously been waiting for her, had obviously stood there, watching her the whole time she tended to Agnes, but there was no reproof in his face or even impatience. His face held some other expression entirely, and she was reminded suddenly of Mr. Dunworthy, standing and watching her through the thin glass partition. Lady Amani cleared her throat, a sound that was almost a growl, and he seemed to come to himself. He handed the book to Cobb, who was wearing a grimy cassock and a pair of two large leather shoes, and knelt in front of the altar. Then he took the book back and began saying the lectins. Kevin said them to herself along with him, thinking the Latin and hearing the echo of the interpreter's translation. "Whom saw the O shepherds?" Father Roach recited in Latin, beginning the responsory speak. "Tell us who hath appeared on the earth." He stopped, frowning at Kevin. He's forgotten it, she thought. She glanced anxiously at Amani, hoping she wouldn't realize there was more to come. But Amani had raised her head and was scowling at him, her jaw and the silk wimple clenched. Roach was still frowning at Kevin. "Speak what saw the," he said, and Kevin gave a sigh of relief. "Tell us who hath appeared." That wasn't right. She mouthed the next line, willing him to understand it. "We saw the newborn child." He gave no indication that he had seen what she said. Though he was looking straight at her, "I saw," he said, and stopped again. "We saw the newborn child," Kevin whispered, and could feel Lady Armani turning to look at her. "An angel singing praise unto the Lord," Roach said, and that wasn't right either. But Lady Amory turned back to the front to fasten her disapproving gaze on Roach. The bishop would no doubt hear about this, and about the candles and the fraying hem. And who knew what other errors and infractions he had committed? "Speak what saw the Kiver mouth," and he seemed suddenly to come to himself. "Speak what saw ye," he said clearly, "and tell us of the birth of Christ." "We saw the newborn child, an angel singing praise unto the Lord," he began the Confio Dio, and Kverin whispered it along with him, but he got through it without any mistakes. And Kverin began to relax a little, though she watched him closely. As he moved to the altar for the Ormastay, he was wearing a black cassock under the alb, and both of them looked like they had once been richly made. They were much too short for Roach. She could see a good 10 cm of his worn brown hose below the cassock's hem. When he bent over the altar, the alb and cassock had probably belonged to the priest before him, or were cast-offs of Hermione's chaplain, the priest at Holy Reformed. Had worn a polyester alb over a brown jumper and jeans. He had assured Kevin that the Mass was completely authentic, in spite of its being held in mid-afternoon. The antiphon dated from the 8th century, he had told her, and the gruesome details. Stations of the Cross were exact copies of Turin's, but the church had been a converted stationer's shop. They had used a folding table for an altar and the Carfax. Caroline outside had been busily destroying it. Came upon the midnight clear. Carrier Ali's son Cobb said, his hands folded in prayer. Carrier Ali's son Father Roach said. Christy Ali's son Cobb said. Christy L's son Agnes said brightly. Kevin hushed her finger to her lips. Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy. They had used the Kyrie at the ecumenical service, probably because of some deal Holy Reform's priest had struck with the vicar, in return for moving the time of the Mass, and the minister of the Church of the Millennium had refused to recite it and had looked coldly disapproving throughout. Like Lady Amory, Father Roach seemed all right now. He said the Gloria and the Gradual without faltering, and began the Gospel, Eni Diem Sancti, Undum Luci. He said and began to read haltingly in Latin. Now it came to pass, in those days, that a decree went forth from Caesar Augustus, that a census of the whole world be taken. The vicar had read the same verses at Somerset. He had read it from the People's Common Bible, which had been insisted on by the Church of the Millennium, and it had begun around then. The politicos dumped a tax hike on the ratepayers, but it was the same gospel Father Roach was laboriously reciting. And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of their heavenly host, praising God and saying, God in the highest and on earth, peace among men of good will. Father Roach kissed the gospel. Per Evangelica dicta de la in Tor Nostra Delicta, the sermon should come next. If there was one, in most village churches, the priest only preached at the major masses, and even then, it was usually no more than a catechism lesson, the listing of the 7 deadly sins, or the 7 acts of mercy. The High Mass Christmas morning was probably when the sermon would be, but Father Roach stepped out in front of the central aisle, which had nearly closed up again as the villagers leaned against the pillars and each other, trying to find a more comfortable position, and began to speak. In the days when Christ came to earth from heaven, God sent signs that men might know his coming. And in the last days there will be famines and pestilence, and Satan will ride abroad in the land. Oh no, Kevin thought. Don't talk about seeing the devil riding a black horse. She glanced at Hermione. The old woman looked furious, but it wouldn't matter what he'd said, Kevin thought. She'd been determined to find mistakes and lapses. she could tell the bishop about. Lady of Voldy looked mildly irritated, and everyone else had the look of tired patience. People always get when listening to a sermon, no matter what the century. Kevin had seen the same look in St. Mary's last Christmas. The sermon at St. Mary's had been on rubbish disposal, and the dean of Christ Church had begun it by saying, "Christianity began in a stable, will it end in a sewer?" But it hadn't mattered, it had been midnight, and St. Mary's had had a stone floor and a real altar, and when she closed her eyes, she'd been able to shut out the carpeted nave and the umbrellas and the laser candles. She had pushed the plastic kneeling pad out of her way and knelt on the stone floor and imagined what it would be like in the Middle Ages. Mr. Dunworthy had told her it wouldn't be like anything she had imagined. And he was right, of course, but not about this Mass. She had imagined it just like this, the stone floor and the murmur of Kyrie, the smells of incense and tallow and cold. The Lord will come with fire and pestilence, and all will perish, Roach said, but even in the last days, God's mercy will not forsake us. He will send us help and comfort, and bring us safely unto heaven. Safely unto heaven. She thought of Mr. Dunworthy. "Don't go," he had said. "It won't be anything like you imagine." And he was right. He was always right. But even he, with all his imaginings of smallpox and cut throats and witch burnings, would never have imagined this, that she was lost, that she didn't know where the drop was, and the rendezvous was less than a week away. She looked across the aisle at Garwin, who was watching Eloise. She had to talk to him after the Mass. Father Roach moved to the altar to begin the Mass. Proper Agnes leaned against Kevin, and Kevin put her arm around her. Poor thing, she must be exhausted, up since before dawn and all that wild running around. She wondered how long the Mass would take. The service at St. Mary's had taken an hour and a quarter, and halfway through the offertory, Dr. Aaron's bleeper had gone off. "It's a baby," she'd whispered to Kevin and Dunworthy, as she'd hurried out. How appropriate. "I wonder if they're in church now," she thought, and then remembered it wasn't Christmas there. They had had Christmas 3 days after she arrived, while she was still ill. It would be January 2nd, Christmas vac nearly over, and all the decorations taken down. It was starting to get hot in the church, and the candlestick seemed to be taking all the air. She could hear shifting and shufflings behind her as Father Roach went through the ritualized steps of the Mass, and Agnes sank farther and farther against her. She was glad when they reached the Sanctus and she could kneel. She tried to imagine Oxford on January 2nd, the shops advertising New Year's sales, and the Carfax Carillon silent. Dr. Aarons would be at the infirmary, dealing with post-holiday stomach upsets, and Mr. Dunworthy would be getting ready for Hillary term. "No, he's not," she thought, and saw him standing behind the thin glass. "He's worrying about me." Father Roach raised the chalice, knelt, kissed the altar. There was more shuffling and a whispering on the men's side of the church. She looked across. Garwin was sitting back on his heels looking bored. Sir Bloet was asleep. So was Agnes. She had collapsed so completely against Kevin, there would be no way she could stand for the Paternoster. She didn't even try when everyone else stood for it. Kivrin took the opportunity to gather Agnes in more closely and shift her head to a better position. Kevin's knee hurt. She must have knelt in the depression. Between two stones, she shifted it, raising it slightly and cramming a fold of her cloak underneath it. Father Roach put a piece of bread in the chalice and said the Haec Commixtio, and everyone knelt for the annual Day on Your Day. Quito lis pica tu mundi miserere nobis, he chanted. Land of God, who takest away the sins of the world, have mercy upon us. Agnus Dei, Lamb of God. Kevin smiled down at Agnes. She was sound asleep, her body a dead weight against Kevin's side, and her mouth slackly open, but her fist was still clenched tightly. Over the little bell, my lamb given in thought. Kneeling on St. Mary's stone floor, she had envisioned the candles and the cold. But not Lady Amani, waiting for Roach to make a mistake in the Mass. Not Eloise or Garwin or Rosamond, not Father Roach. With his cut-throat's face and worn-out hose, she could never in 100 years, even in 730 for years, have imagined Agnes with her puppy, and her naughty tantrums and her infected knee. I'm glad I came, she thought. In spite of everything, Father Roach made the sign of the cross with the chalice and drank it. Dominus vobiscum, he said. And there was a general commotion behind Kevin. The main part of the show was over, and people were leaving now to avoid the crush. Apparently there was no deference to the Lord's family when it came to leaving or even in waiting. Till they were outside to begin talking, she could scarcely hear the dismissal. "Hetemst," Father Roach said over the din, and Lady Amani was in the aisle before he could even lower his raised hand, looking like she intended to leave for Bath, and the bishop immediately "Saw you the tallow candles by the altar," she said to Lady of Oldie. "I bade him use the beeswax candles that I gave him." Lady of Oldie shook her head and looked darkly at Father Roach, and the two of them swept out, with Rosamond right at their heels. Rosamond obviously had no intention of walking back to the manor with Sir Bloet if she could help it, and this should do it. The villagers had closed in behind the three women, talking and laughing, by the time he huffed and puffed his way to his feet. They would be all the way to the manor. Kevin was having trouble getting up herself. Her foot had gone to sleep, and Agnes was dead to the world. "Agnes," she said, "wake up, it's time to go home." Sir Blowhard had got to his feet, his face nearly purple with the effort, and had come across to offer Eloise his arm. "Your daughter has fallen asleep," he said. "Aye," Eloise said, glancing at Agnes. She took his arm, and they started out. "Your husband has not come as he promised." "Nay." Kevin heard Eloise say. Her grip tightened on his arm. Outside the bells began to ring all at once, and out of time a wild, irregular chiming. It sounded wonderful. "Agnes," Kevin said, shaking her, "it's time to ring your bell." She didn't even stir. Kivrin tried to get the sleeping child under her shoulder. Her arms flopped limply over Kivrin's shoulders, and the bell jangled. "You waited all night to ring your bell," Kivrin said, getting to one knee. "Wake up, lamb." She looked around for someone to help her. There was scarcely anyone left in the church. Cobb was making the rounds of the windows, pinching the candle flames out between his chapped fingers. Garwin and Sir Bloet's nephews were at the back of the nave, buckling on their swords. Father Roach was nowhere to be seen. She wondered if he was the one ringing the bell. With such joyous enthusiasm, her numb foot was beginning to tingle. She flexed it in the thin shoe, and then put her weight on it. It felt terrible, but she could stand on it. She hoisted Agnes farther over her shoulder, and tried to stand up. Her foot caught in the hem of her skirt, and she pitched forward. Garwin caught her. "Good Lady Catherine, my Lady Eloise bade me come to help you," he said, steadying her. He lifted Agnes easily out of her arms and onto his shoulder and strode out of the church, Kivrin hobbling beside him. "Thank you," Kevin said, when they were out of the jammed churchyard. "My arms felt like they were going to fall off." "She is a stout lass," he said. Anna's bell slid off her wrist and fell onto the snow, clattering with the other bells. As it fell, Kevin stooped and picked it up. The knot was almost too small to be seen, and the short ends of ribbon beyond it were frayed into thin threads. But the moment she took hold of it, the knot came undone. She tied it on Anna's dangling wrist with a little bow. "I am glad to assist a lady in distress," Garwin said, but she didn't hear him. They were all alone on the green. The rest of the family was nearly to the man gate. She could see the steward holding the lantern over Lady Amani and Lady Avali. As they started into the passage, there were a lot of people still in the churchyard, and someone had built a bonfire next to the road, and people were standing around it, warming their hands and passing a wooden bowl of something. But here halfway across the green, they were all alone. The opportunity she had thought would never come was here. I wanted to thank you for trying to find my attackers, and for rescuing me in the woods and bringing me here. She said when you found me, how far from here was the place? Could you take me to it? He stopped and looked at her. Did they not tell you, he said. All of your goods and gear that were found, I brought to the manor. The thieves had taken your belongings, and though I rode after them, I fear I found naught. He started walking again. I know you brought my boxes here. Thank you, but that wasn't why. I wanted to see the place you found me, Kevin said rapidly, afraid they would catch up with the others before she finished asking him. Lady Amory had stopped and was looking back their way. She had to get it asked. Before Amory sent the steward back to see what was keeping them. I lost my memory when I was injured in the attack, she said. I thought if I could see the place where you found me, I might remember something. He had stopped again and was looking at the road above the church. There were lights there, bobbing unsteadily and coming rapidly nearer. Latecomers to church. You're the only one who knows where the place is, Kevin said, or I wouldn't bother you. But if you could just tell me where it is, I could. There's nothing there, he said vaguely, still looking at the lights. I brought your wagon and your boxes to the manor. I know, Kevin said, and I thank you, but they are in the barn. He said. He turned at the sound of horses. The bobbing lights were lanterns, carried by men on horseback. They galloped past the church and through the village, at least a half dozen of them, and pulled up short, where Lady Eloise and the others were standing. It's her husband, Kevin thought, but before she could finish her thought, Garwin had thrust Agnes into her arms and taken off toward them, pulling his sword as he ran. Oh no! Kevin thought and began to run. Too clumsy under Agnes's weight, it wasn't her husband. It was the men who were after them, the reason they were hiding. The reason Eloise had been so angry at Hermione for telling Sir Bloet they were here. The men with the torches had got down off their horses. Eloise walked forward to one of the three men, still on horseback, and then fell to her knees as if she'd been struck. No, oh no, Kevin thought, out of breath. And Mrs. Bell jangled wildly as she ran. Garwin ran up to them, his sword flashing in the lantern light. And then he was on his knees too. Eloise stood up and stepped forward to the men on horseback, her arm out in a gesture of welcome. Kevin stopped, out of breath. Sir Bloet came forward, knelt, stood up. The men on horseback flung back their hoods. They were wearing hats of some kind or crowns. Garwin, still on his knees, sheathed his sword. One of the men on horseback raised his hand, and something glittered. What is it? Agnes said sleepily. I don't know, Kivrin said. Agnes twisted around in Kivrin's arms so she could see. It is the Three Kings, she said wonderingly. Transcript from the Doomsday Book. Christmas Eve 1320 Old Style. An envoy from the bishop has arrived. Along with two other churchmen, they rode in just after midnight mass. Lady Amani is delighted. She's convinced they've come in response to her message, demanding a new chaplain, but I'm not convinced of that. They've come without any servants, and there's an air of nervousness about them, as if they were on some secret, hurried mission. It has to concern Lord Guillaume, though. The assizes are a secular court, not an ecclesiastical one. Perhaps the bishop is a friend of Lord Guillaume's, or of King Edward II's, and they've come to strike some sort of deal with Eloise for his freedom. Whatever their reason for being here, they're here in style. Agnes thought they were the Three Magi when she first saw them, and they do look like royalty. The bishop's envoy has a thin, aristocratic face, and they are all dressed like kings. One of them has a purple velvet cloak, with the design of a white cross sewn in silk on the back of it. Lady Amani immediately latched onto him with her sad story of how ignorant, clumsy, generally impossible Father Roach is. He deserves not a parish, she said. Unfortunately, and luckily for Father Roach, he was not the envoy, but only his clerk. The envoy was the one in the red, also very impressive. With gold embroidery and a sable hem, the third is a Cistercian monk. At least he wears the white habit of one, though it's made of even finer wool than my cloak, and has a silk cord for sash, and he wears a ring, fit for a king, on each of his fat fingers, but he doesn't act like a monk. He and the envoy both demanded wine before they'd even dismounted, and it's obvious that Clark had already drunk a good deal. Before he got here, he slipped just now getting off his horse, and had to be supported into the hall by the fat monk, Brake. I was apparently wrong about the reason for their coming here. Eloise and Sir Bloet went off in a corner with the bishop's envoy as soon as they got in the house, but they only talked to him for a few minutes, and I just heard her tell Amani they have heard naught of Guillaume. Amani didn't seem surprised, or even particularly concerned at this news. It's clear she thinks they're here to bring her a new chaplain, and she's falling all over them, insisting that the Christmas feast be brought in immediately, and that the bishop's envoy sit in the high seat. They seem more interested in drinking than in eating. Amani fetched them cups of wine herself, and they've already gone through them and called for more. The clerk caught hold of Macy's skirt as she brought the pitcher, pulled her in hand over hand, and stuck his hand down her shift. She, of course, clapped her hands over her ears. The one good thing about them being here is that they add tremendously to the general confusion. I only had a moment to talk to Garwin, but sometime in the next day or so, I'll surely be able to speak to him without anyone noticing, especially since a miner's attention is riveted on the envoy, who just grabbed the pitcher from Mazery and poured his wine himself, and get him to show me where the drop is. There's plenty of time. I have nearly a week. Chapter 21. 2 more people died on the 28th, both of them primaries, who had been at the dance in Headington. And Latema had a stroke. He developed myocarditis, which caused a thromboembolism, Mary had said when she phoned. At this point, he's completely unresponsive. Over half of Dunworthy's detainees were down with the flu, and there was only room in infirmary for the most severe cases. Dunworthy and Finch and a Detney William had found, who had a year of nurses' training, gave tongue and dispensed orange juice around the clock. Dunworthy made up carts and gave medications, and worried when he had told Mary about the trees, saying, "That can't be right of his saying it was the rats." She had said, "It's the fever, James. It has no connection with reality. I've one patient who keeps talking about the Queen's elephants, but he could not get the idea of Kivrin's being in 1348 out of his mind. What year is it? Bartery had said that first night, and that can't be right." Dunworthy had telephoned Andrews after his argument with Gilchrist and told him he couldn't get access to Brasnos's net. "It doesn't matter," Andrews had said. "The locational coordinates aren't as critical as the temporals. I'll get an L and L on the dig from Jesus. I've already talked to them about doing the parameter checks, and they said it's all right." The visuals had been off again, but he had sounded nervous, as if he were afraid Dunworthy would broach the subject again of his coming to Oxford. "I've done some research on slippage," he said. "There are no theoretical limits, but in practice, the mineral slippage is always greater than zero, even in uninhabited areas. Maximal slippage has never gone above 5 years, and those were all on mans. The greatest slippage on a man drop was a 17th century remote 226 days. Is there anything else it could be?" Dunworthy had asked. "Anything besides the slippage that could go wrong? If the coordinates are correct, nothing," Andrews had said and promised to report as soon as he'd done the parameter checks. 5 years was 1325. The plague had not even begun in China then. And Bardia told Gilchrist there was minimal slippage, and it couldn't be the coordinates. Bardia checked them before he fell ill. but the fear continued to nag at him, and he spent the few free moments he could snatch telephoning texts, trying to find someone willing to come read the fix. When the sequencing arrived and Gilchrist opened the laboratory again, it was supposed to have arrived yesterday. But when Mary phoned, she had still been waiting for it. She phoned again in the late afternoon. "Can you set up a ward?" she asked. The visuals were back on. Her SPGs looked like she'd slept in them, and her mask dangled from her neck by one tie. "I've already set up a ward." He said, "It's full of detainees. We've got 31 cases as of this afternoon. Do you have space to set up another one?" "I don't need it yet," she said tiredly. "But at this rate I will. We're nearly at capacity here. And several of the staff are either down with it or are refusing to come in, and the sequencing hasn't come yet." He asked. "No, the WIC just phoned. They got a faulty result the first time through and had to run it again. It's supposed to be here tomorrow. Now they think it's a Uruguayan virus." She smiled wanly. "But Dre hasn't been in contact with anyone from Uruguay, has he? How soon can you have the beds ready?" "By this evening," Dunworthy said, but Finch informed him they were nearly out of folding cots, and he had to go to the NHS and argue them. Out of a dozen, they didn't get the ward set up in two of the fellows' teaching rooms until morning. Finch, helping assemble the cots and make beds, announced that they were nearly out of clean linens, face masks, and lavatory paper. "We haven't enough for the detainees," he said, tucking in a sheet, "let alone all these patients. And we have no bandages at all. It's not a war." Dunworthy said, "I doubt it there'll be any wounded. Did you find out if any of the other colleges has a tech here in Oxford?" "Yes, sir. I telephoned all of them, but none of them did." He tucked a pillow beneath his chin. "I've posted notices asking that everyone conserve lavatory paper, but it's done no good at all. The Americans are particularly wasteful." He tugged the pillow slip up over the pillow. "I do feel rather sorry for them, though. Helen came down with it last night. You know, and they haven't any alternates. Helen, Miss Bontini, the tenor. She has a fever of 39.7. The Americans won't be able to do their Chicago surprise, which is probably a blessing," Dunworthy thought. "Ask them if they'll continue to keep watch on my telephone, even if they're no longer practicing." He said, "I'm expecting several important calls." Did Andrews ring back? "No, sir, not yet, and the visual is off." He plumped the pillow. "It is too bad about the peel. They could do Stedman's, of course, but that's old hat. It does seem a pity there's no alternative solution." "Did you get the list of texts?" "Yes, sir," Finch said, struggling with a reluctant cot. He motioned with his head. "It's there by the chalkboard." Dunworthy picked up the sheets of paper and looked at the one on top. It was filled with columns of numbers, all of them with the digits 1 through 6, in varying order. "That's not it," Finch said, snatching the papers away. "Those are the changes for the Chicago surprise." He handed Dunworthy a single sheet. "Here it is. I've listed the texts by college, with addresses and telephone numbers." Colin came in wearing his wet jacket and carrying a roll of tape and a plasticine-covered bundle. "The vicar says I'm to put these up in all the wards," he said, taking out a placard that read, "Feeling disoriented, muddled. Mental confusion can be a warning sign of the flu." He tore off a strip of tape and stuck the placard to the chalkboard. "I was just posting these at the infirmary. And what do you think the Gold Stone was doing?" he said, taking another placard out of the bundle. It read, "Wear your face mask." He taped it to the wall above the cot. Finch was making up, reading the Bible to the patients. He pocketed the tape. "I hope I don't catch it." He tucked the rest of the placards under his arm and started out, "Wear your face mask." Dunworthy said. Colin grinned. "That's what the gallstone said. And she said the Lord would smite anyone who heeded not the words of the righteous." He pulled the gray plaid muffler out of his pocket I wear this instead of a face mask," he said, tying it over his mouth and nose, highwayman fashion. "Cloth cannot keep out microscopic viruses." Dunworthy said, "I know it's the color. It frightens them away," he darted out. Dunworthy rang Mary to tell her the ward was ready, but couldn't get through, so he went over to infirmary. The rain had let up a little and people, mostly wearing masks, were out again, coming back from the grocer's and queuing in front of the chemist. But the streets seemed hushed, unnaturally silent. Someone's turned the carol on off. Dunworthy thought he almost regretted it. Mary was in her office staring at a screen. "The sequencing's arrived," she said, before he could tell her about the ward. "Have you told Gilchrist?" he said eagerly. "No," she said. "It's not the Uruguay virus or the South Carolina. What is it?" "It's an H9N2. Both the South Carolina and the Uruguay were H3s. "And where did it come from?" "The WIC doesn't know. It's not a known virus, it's previously unsequenced." She handed him a printout. "It has a 7-point mutation, which explains why it's killing people." He looked at the printout. It was covered with columns of numbers, like Finch's list of changes, and is unintelligible. "It has to come from somewhere, not necessarily. Approximately every 10 years, there's a major antigenic shift with epidemic potential. So it may have originated with Boudreaux." She took the printout back from him. "Does he live around livestock? Do you know livestock?" He said he lives in a flat in Headington. "Mutant strains are sometimes produced by the intersection of an avian virus with a human strain. The WIC wants us to check possible avian contacts and exposure to radiation. Viral mutations have sometimes been caused by X-rays." She studied the printout as though it made sense. "It's an unusual mutation. There's no recombination of the hemagglutinin genes, only an extremely large point mutation. No wonder she had not told Gilchrist. He had said he would open the laboratory when the sequencing arrived, but this news would only convince him. He should keep it closed. Is there a cure? There will be as soon as an analog can be manufactured. And a vaccine? They've already begun work on the prototype. How long? 3 to 5 days to produce a prototype. Then at least another 5 to manufacture. If they don't run into any difficulty with duplicating the proteins, we should be able to begin inoculating by the 10th. And that was when they could begin giving immunizations. How long would it take to immunize the quarantine area? A week, 2, before Gilchrist and the idiot. Protesters considered it safe to open the laboratory. That's too long, Dunworthy said. I know, Mary said inside. God knows how many cases we'll have by then. There have been 20 new ones already this morning. Do you think it's a mutant strain? Dunworthy asked. She thought about it. No, I think it's much more likely that Battery caught it from someone at that dance in Headington. There may have been new Hindus there, or Earthers, or someone else who doesn't believe in anti-viruses or modern medicine. The Canadian goose flu of 2010, if you'll remember, was traced back to a Christian Science commune. There's a source, we'll find it. And what about Kivrin in the meantime? What if you don't find the source by the rendezvous? Kivrin's supposed to come back on January 6th. Will you have it sourced by then? I don't know, she said wearily. She may not want to come back to a century. That's rapidly becoming a 10. She may want to stay in 1320. If she's in 1320, he thought, and went up to see Bardry. He had not mentioned rats since Christmas night. He was back to the afternoon at Balliol. When he had come looking for Dunworthy, laboratory, he murmured when he saw Dunworthy. He tried feebly to hand him a note, and then seemed to sink into sleep, exhausted by the effort. Dunworthy stayed only a few minutes, and then went to see Gilchrist. It was raining hard again. By the time he reached Brazen-Nosed, the gaggle of picketers were huddling, underneath their banners shivering. The porter was standing at the large desk, taking the decorations off the little Christmas tree. He glanced up at Dunworthy and looked suddenly alarmed. Dunworthy walked past him and through the gate. You can't go in there, Mr. Dunworthy. The porter called after him, "The college is restricted." Gumworthy walked into the quad. Gilchrist's rooms were in the building. Behind the laboratory, he hurried toward them, expecting the porter to catch up to him and try to stop him. The laboratory had a large yellow sign on it that read, "No admittance without authorization," and an electronic alarm attached to the door jamb. "Mr. Dunworthy," Gilchrist said, striding toward him through the rain. "The porter must have phoned him. The laboratory is off limits." "I came to see you," Dunworthy said. The porter came up trailing a tinsel garland. "Shall I phone for the university police?" he asked. "That won't be necessary. Come up to my rooms," he said to Dunworthy. "I have something I want you to see." He led Dunworthy into his office, sat down at his cluttered desk, and put on an elaborate mask with some sort of filters. "I've just spoken to the WIC," he said. His voice sounded hollow, as if it were coming from a great distance. "The virus is a previously unsequenced virus, whose source is unknown. It's been sequenced now," Dunworthy said. "And the analog and vaccine are due to arrive in a few days. Dr. Ahrens has arranged for a brazen nose to be given immunization priority, and I am attempting to locate a tech who can read the fix as soon as immunization has been completed. I'm afraid that's impossible." Gilchrist said hollowly, "I've been conducting research into the incidence of influenza. In the 1300s, there are clear indications that a series of influenza epidemics in the first half of the 14th century severely weakened the populace, thereby lowering their resistance in the Black Death." He picked up an ancient-looking book. "I have found 6 separate references to outbreaks between October of 1318 and February of 1321. He held up a book and began to read. "Dawson, a fever so fierce as to leave many dead. This fever began with an aching in the head and confusion in all the parts. The doctors bled them, but many died in spite. A fever in an age of fevers. Typhoid and cholera and measles, all of them producing aching of the head and confusion in all the parts. 1319, the barter sizes for the previous year were cancelled," Gilchrist said, holding up another book. "A malady of the chest that fell upon the court, so that none, nor judge nor jury, were left to hear the cases." Gilchrist said. He looked at Grimworthy over the mask. "You stated that the public's fears over the net were hysterical and unfounded. It would seem, however, that they are based in solid historical fact. Solid historical fact. References to fevers and maladies of the chest. That could be anything: blood poisoning or typhus, or any of 100 nameless infections. All of which was beside the point. The virus cannot have come through the net." He said, "Drops have been made to the pandemic, to World War I battles in which mustard gas was used, to Tel Aviv 20th century. Sent detection equipment to the site of St. Paul's. 2 days after the pinpoint was dropped, nothing comes through." So you say he held up a printout. Probability indicates a 0.003% possibility of a microorganism being transmitted through the net, and a 20 to 0.1% chance of a viable mixture virus being within the critical area when the net was opened. "Where in God's name do you get these figures?" Dunworthy said. "Pull them out of a hat according to probability," he said, putting a nasty emphasis on the word. "There was only a 0.04% chance of anyone's being present when Kevin went through. A possibility you consider statistically insignificant. Viruses are exceptionally sturdy organisms," Gilchrist said. "They have been known to lie dormant for long periods of time, exposed to extremes of temperature and humidity, and still be viable under certain conditions. They form crystals, which retain their structure indefinitely. When put back into solution, they become infectious again. Viable tobacco. Mosaic crystals have been found. Dating from the 16th century, there is clearly a significant risk of the viruses penetrating the net. If opened and under the circumstances, I cannot possibly allow the net to be opened. The virus cannot have come through the net, Dunworthy said. Then why are you so anxious to have the fix read? Because Dunworthy said, and stopped to get control of himself. Because reading the fix will tell us whether the drop went as planned, or whether something went wrong. Oh, you'll admit there's a possibility of error then. Gilchrist said, then why not? An error that would allow a virus through the net. As long as that possibility exists, the laboratory will remain locked, I'm certain. Mr. Basingham will approve of the course of action I've taken. Basingham, Dunworthy thought, that's what this is all about. Has nothing to do with the virus or the protesters, or maladies of the chest in 1318. This is all to justify himself to Basingham. Gilchrist was acting head in Basingham's absence, and he had rushed through the re-ranking. Rushed through a drop intending, no doubt, to present Basingham with a brilliant finale complete. But he hadn't got it. Instead, he'd got an epidemic, and a lost historian, and people picketing the college. And now all he cared about was vindicating his actions. Saving himself even though it meant sacrificing Kivrin. What about Kevin? Does Kevin approve of your course of action? He said. Miss Engel was fully aware of the risks. When she volunteered to go to 1320, Gilchrist said, was she aware you intended to abandon her? This conversation is over, Mr. Dunworthy. Gilchrist stood up. I will open the laboratory when the virus has been sourced, and it has been proven to my satisfaction that there is no chance it came through the net. He showed Dunworthy to the door. The porter was waiting outside. I have no intention of allowing you to abandon Kevin, Dunworthy said. Gilchrist crimped his lips under the mask. And I have no intention of allowing you to endanger the health of this community. He turned to the porter. Escort Mr. Dunworthy to the gate. If he attempts to enter Bray's Nose again, telephone the police. He slammed the door. The porter walked Dunworthy across the quad, watching him warily, as if he thought he might turn suddenly dangerous. I might, Dunworthy thought. I want to use your telephone, he said when they reached the gate. University business. The porter looked nervous, but he set a telephone on the counter and watched, while Dunworthy punched Balliol's number. When Finch answered, he said, we've got to locate Basingham. It's an emergency. Phone the Scottish Fishing License Bureau and compile a list of hotels and inns. And get me Polly Wilson's number. He wrote down the number, rang off and started to punch it in, and then thought better of it and telephoned Mary. I want to help source the virus. He said. Gilchrist wouldn't open the net. She said no, he said. What can I do to help with the sourcing? What you were doing before with the primaries. Trace the contacts, look for the things I told you about exposure to radiation, proximity to birds or livestock, religions that forbid antivirals. You'll need the contacts charts. I'll send Colin for them, he said. I'll have someone get them ready. You'd better check Bottery's contacts back for 6 days, as well in case the virus did originate with him. The time of incubation from a reservoir can be longer than a person-to-person incubation period. I'll put William on it, he said. He pushed the phone back at the porter, who immediately came around the counter and walked him out to the pavement. Dunworthy was surprised. He didn't follow him all the way to Balliol. As soon as he got there, he phoned Polly Wilson. Is there some way you can get into the Nets console without having access to the laboratory? He asked her. Can you go in directly through the university's computer? I don't know, she said. The university's computer is moded. I might be able to rig a battering ram or worm in from Balliol's console. I'll have to see what the safeties are. Do you have a tech to read it? If I can get it set up, I'm getting one. He said. He ran off. Colin came in dripping wet to get another roll of tape. Did you know the sequencing came? And the virus is a mutant? Yes, Dunworthy said. I want you to go to infirmary and get the contacts charts from your great-aunt. Colin set down his load of placards. The one on top read, do not have a relapse. They're saying it's some sort of biological weapon. Colin said they're saying it escaped from a laboratory, not Gilchrist, he thought bitterly. Do you know where William Gadsden is? No, Colin made a face. He's probably on the staircase kissing someone. He was in the buttery embracing one of the detainees. Downworthy told him to find out Bardry's whereabouts for Thursday through Sunday morning, and to obtain a copy of Basingham's credit records for December, and went back to his rooms to telephone text. One of them was running a net for 19th century in Moscow, and two of them had gone skiing. The others weren't at home. Or perhaps alerted by Andrews they weren't answering. Colin brought the contacts charts. They were a disaster. No attempt had been made to correlate any of the information, except possible American connections, and there were too many contacts. Half of the primaries had been at the dance in Headington. 2/3 of them had gone Christmas shopping. All but 2 of them had ridden the tube. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack. He spent half the night checking religious affiliations and running cross matches. 42 of them were Church of England, 9 Holy Reformed, 17 unaffiliated, 8 were students at Shrewsbury College, 11 had stood in line at Debenhams to see Father Christmas, 9 had worked on Montoya's dig, 30 had shopped at Blackwell's, 21 of them had cross contacts with at least 2 secondaries, and Debenhams' Father Christmas had contact with 32, all but 11 at a pub after his shift. But none of them could be traced to all the primaries, except Boudra. Mary brought the overflow cases in the morning. She was wearing SPGs but no mask. Are the beds ready? She said yes. We've got 2 wards of 10 beds each. Good. I'll need all of them. They helped the patients into the makeshift ward and into bed, and left them in the care of William's nurse trainee. The stretcher cases will be over as soon as we have an ambulance free, Mary said, walking back across the quad with Dunworthy. The rain had stopped completely and the sky was lighter, as if it might clear. When will the analog arrive? He asked. It'll be 2 days at the least, she said. They reached the gate. She leaned against the stone passageway. When all this is over, I'm going to go through the net, she said, to some century where there aren't any epidemics, where there isn't any waiting or worrying, or helpless standing by. She pushed her hand back over her gray hair. Some century that isn't a 10, she smiled. Only there isn't one, is there? He shook his head. Did I ever tell you about the Valley of the Kings? She said. You said you saw it during the pandemic. She nodded. Cairo was quarantined, so we had to fly out of Addis Ababa, and on the way down I bribed a taxi driver to take us to the Valley of the Kings, so I could see Tutankhamun's tomb. She said it was a foolhardy thing to do. The pandemic had already reached Luxor, and we just missed being caught in the quarantine. We were shot at twice. She shook her head. We might have been killed. My sister refused to get out of the car, but I went down the stairs and up to the door of the tomb, and I thought, this is what it was like when Carter found it. She looked at Downworthy and through him, remembering it. When they found the door to the tomb, it was locked, and they were supposed to wait for the proper authorities to open it. Carter drilled a hole in the door and held a candle up and looked through. Her voice was hushed. Carnarvon said, "Can you see anything?" And Carter said, "Yes, wonderful things." She closed her eyes. I've never forgotten that, standing there at that closed door. I can see it clearly even now. She opened her eyes. Perhaps that's where I'll go when this is over. To the opening of King Tut's tomb. She leaned out the gate. Oh dear. It started raining again. I must get back. I'll send the stretcher cases as soon as there's an ambulance. She looked sharply at him. Why aren't you wearing your mask? It causes my spectacles to steam up. Why aren't you wearing yours? We're running out of them. You've had your T-cell enhancement, haven't you? He shook his head. I haven't had any time. Make time, she said, and wear your mask. You'll be of no help to Kivrin if you fall ill. I have no help to give him now. He thought, walking back across to his rooms, I can't get into the laboratory. I can't get a tech to come to Oxford. I can't find Basingham. He tried to think who else he should contact. He checked every booking agent and fishing guide and boat rental in Scotland. There was no trace of the man. Perhaps Montoya was right. And he wasn't in Scotland at all, but off in the tropics somewhere with a woman, Montoya. He'd forgotten completely about her. He hadn't seen her since the Christmas Eve service. She'd been looking for Basingham then, so he could sign the authorization for her to go out to the dig. And then she had rung up on Christmas Day to ask whether Basingham was trout or salmon, and rung back with the message, never mind, which might mean she had found out not only whether he was salmon or trout, but the man himself. He climbed a staircase to his rooms. If Montoya had located Basingham and got her authorization, she would have gone straight out to the dig. She would not have waited to tell anyone he was. Not even certain she knew he was looking for Basingham, too. Basingham would surely have come back as soon as Montoya told him about the quarantine, unless he had been stopped by bad weather or impassable roads. Or Montoya might not have told him about the quarantine, obsessed as she was with the dig. She might merely have told him she needed his signature. Miss Taylor her for healthy bell ringers, and Finch were in his rooms. Standing in a circle and bending their knees, Finch was holding a paper in one hand and counting under his breath. I was just going over to the ward to assign nurses. He said sheepishly, here's William's report. He handed it to Downworthy and scurried out. Miss Taylor and her foreman gathered up their handbell cases. A Miss Wilson called. Miss Taylor said, she said to tell you a battering ram won't work, and you'll have to go in through Brasenose console. Thank you, Dunworthy said. She went out her for bell ringers in a line behind her. He rang the dig, no answer. He rang Montoya's flat, her office at Brazeau. The dig again, there was no answer at any of them. He phoned her flat again and let it ring while he looked at William's report. Badri had spent all day Saturday and Sunday morning working at the dig. William must have been in contact with Montoya. To find that out, he wondered suddenly about the dig itself. It was out in the country from Whitney, on a National Trust farm. Perhaps it had ducks or chickens or pigs or all three. Amberdra had spent an entire day and a half working there, digging in the mud. A perfect chance to come in contact with the reservoir. Colin came and soaked to the skin. They ran out of placards, he said, rummaging through his duffel. London sending some more tomorrow. He unearthed his gobstopper and popped it, lint and all, into his mouth. Do you know who's standing on your staircase? He asked. He flung himself onto the window seat and opened his Middle Ages book. William and some girl kissing and talking. All lovey-dovey, I could scarcely get past. Danworthy opened the door. William disengaged himself reluctantly from a small brunette in a Burberry and came in. Do you know where Miss Montoya is? Dunworthy asked. No, the NHS said she's out at the dig. But she's not answering the phone. She's probably out in the churchyard or somewhere on the farm and can't hear it. I thought of using a screamer, but then I remembered this girl who's reading our Keogh history. And he nodded toward the small brunette. She told me she saw the assignment sheets out at the dig, and Battery was signed up for Saturday and Sunday. A screamer, what's that? You hook it to the line, and it magnifies the ring on the other end. If the person's out in the garden, or in the shower or something. Can you put one on this phone? They're a bit too complicated for me. I know a student who might be able to rig it though. I've got her number in my rooms. He left holding hands with the brunette. You know, if Miss Montoya is at the dig, I could get you through the perimeter. Colin said he took his gobstopper out and examined it. It'll be easy. There are lots of places that aren't watched. The guards don't like to stand out in the rain. "I have no intention of breaking quarantine," Dunworthy said. "We are trying to stop this epidemic, not spread it." "That's how the plague was spread during the Black Death," Colin said, taking the gobstopper out and examining it. "It was a sickly yellow. They kept trying to run away from it. But they just took it along with them." William stuck his head in the door. "She says it'd take 2 days to set it up, but she's got one on her phone if you want to use that." Colin grabbed for his jacket. "Can I go?" "No," Dunworthy said. "And get out of those wet clothes. I don't want you catching the flu." He went down the stairs with William. "She's an undergraduate at Shrewsbury," William said, heading off through the rain. Colin caught up with them halfway across the quad. "I can't catch it, I have my enhancement," he said. They didn't have quarantines during the Black Death, so it went everywhere. He pulled his muffler out of his jacket pocket. Botley Road's a good place to sneak through the perimeter. There's a pub on the corner by the blockade, and the guard nips in now and again. "For something to keep warm, fasten your jacket," Dunworthy said. The girl turned out to be Polly Wilson, she told Dunworthy. She had been working on an optical tracer that could break into the console, but hadn't managed it yet. Dunworthy phoned the dig, but there was no answer. "Let it ring." Polly said she may have a long trek to get to it. The screamer's got a range of half a kilometer. He let it ring for 10 minutes, put the receiver down, waited 5 minutes. Tried again and let it ring a quarter of an hour. Before admitting defeat, Polly was looking longingly at William, and Colin was shivering in his wet jacket. Dunworthy took him home and put him to bed. "Or I could sneak through the perimeter and tell her to phone you," Colin said, putting his gobstopper back in the duffel. "If you're worried about being too old to go, I'm very good at getting through perimeters." Dunworthy waited till William returned the next morning, and then went back to Shrewsbury and tried again. But to no avail. "I'll set it to ring at half-hour intervals," Polly said, walking him to the gate. "You wouldn't know if William has any other girlfriends." "Would you know?" Dunworthy said. The sound of bells clanged out suddenly from the direction of Christ Church, pealing loudly through the rain. "Has someone switched that horrid carillon on again?" Polly asked, leaning out to listen. "No," he said. "It's the Americans." He cocked his head in the direction of the sound, trying to determine whether Miss Taylor had settled for Stedman's, but he could hear 6 bells. The ancient bells of Osney, Deuce and Gabriel and Marie, one after the other, Clement and Haute Clerc and Taylor and Finch. They sounded remarkably good, not at all like the digital carillon, not at all like "O Christ," who interfaces with the world. They rang out clearly and brightly and down where they could almost see. The bell ringers in their circle, in the belfry, bending their knees and raising their arms, Finch referring to his list of numbers. Every man must stick to his bell without interruption. Miss Taylor had said he had had nothing but interruptions. But he felt oddly cheered nonetheless. Miss Taylor had not been able to get her bell ringers to Norwich for Christmas Eve, but she had stuck to her bells, and they rang out deafeningly, deliriously overhead like a celebration. A victory like Christmas morning. He would find Montoya and Basingham. Or a tech who wasn't afraid of the quarantine. He would find Kivrin. The telephone was ringing when he got back to Bailey. He galloped up the stairs, hoping it was Polly. It was Montoya. "Dunworthy," she said. "Hi, it's Lupe Montoya. What's going on?" "Where are you?" he demanded. "At the dig," she said. But that was already apparent. She was standing in front of the ruined nave of the church, in the half-excavated medieval churchyard. He could see why she had been so anxious to get back to her dig. There was as much as a foot of water in places. She had draped a motley assortment of tarps and plastic sheets over the excavation, but rain was dripping in at a dozen places, and where the sagging coverings met, spilling down the edges in veritable waterfalls. Everything, the gravestones, The battery light ship clipped to the tops. The shovel stacked against the wall was covered in mud. Montoya was covered in mud too. She was wearing her terrorist jacket and thigh-high fisherman's waders. Like Basingham wherever he was might be wearing, and they were wet and filthy. The hand she was holding the telephone with was caked with dried mud. "I've been ringing you for days," Dunworthy said. "I can't hear the phone over the pump." She gestured towards something outside the picture. Presumably the pump, though he couldn't hear anything, save for the thump of rain on the tops. "It's just broken a belt, and I don't have another one." "I heard the bells. Do they mean that quarantine's over?" "Hardly," he said. "We're in the midst of a full-scale epidemic. 780 cases and 16 deaths. Haven't you seen the papers?" "I haven't seen anything or anybody since I got here. I've spent the last 6 days trying to keep this damn dig above water. But I can't do it all by myself and without a pump." She pushed her heavy, black hair back from her face with a dirty hand. "What were they ringing the bells for then, if the quarantine's not over?" A peal of Chicago surprise minor. She looked irritated. "If the quarantine's as bad as all that, why aren't they doing something useful?" "They are." He thought. "They made you telephone." "I could certainly put them to work out here." She pushed her hair back again. She looked nearly as tired as Mary. "I was really hoping the quarantine had been lifted, so I could get some people out here to help." "How long do you think it'll be?" "Too long," he thought, watching the rain cascade in between the tops. "You'll never get the help you need in time. I need some information about Pacinco and Chadori," he said. "We're attempting to source the virus, and we need to know who Chadori had contact with." Chadori worked at the dig on the 18th and the morning of the 19th. "Who else was there when he was?" "I was." "Who else?" "No one. I've had a terrible time getting help all December. Every one of my Archeo history students took off the day VAX started. I've had to scrounge volunteers wherever I could."